A young man, a blonde man, and a girl with blue hair were sitting at the same table opposite each other. The guy turned to her, declaring that he wanted to break off their upcoming engagement. Hearing this, the heroine's face turned red and tears appeared in her eyes. She immediately grabbed the cup of her tea with her shaking hands, after which the dishes immediately flew into the young man's face, and all the liquid splashed around. He instinctively closed his eyes, trying to avoid being hit. The girl was outraged by his statement and was very nervous. Jumping up from her seat, she replied that she did not agree with his decision and did not intend to agree with it ever again. Turning around, she quickly walked away. Tears were still in the eyes of the Duke's eldest daughter. Her name was Capella Axanon. Apparently this really hurt the girl. Her fiancé was the second Prince Oberon, who announced that he was going to break off the engagement, and she, as the only girl in the Grand Duke's family, would not be able to accept this. The heroine didn't understand whether she should tell her father about this, but on the other hand, she understood that the Reaper of Death would not care about her even in such a situation. While Capella was running, a girl appeared in front of her, whose appearance was comparable to that of an angel. She literally glowed. It was Yuno. She, noticing how the main character was crying, asked the reason for such a mood. She, raising her eyes full of tears to her friend, stuttered and began the story. After that, without a moment's hesitation, Yuno pulled the girl into her arms, declaring that everything would be fine. She stood silently, not moving, apparently not expecting this at all. Then the girl stepped back, putting her hand on the heroine's head, and advised her to talk to her fiancé again, because she was sure that he would understand everything. After thinking it over a little, Capella, beaming, agreed with her friend. Smiling at her, the heroine thanked Yuna, turning around and getting ready to go to her fiancé, because she was going to talk to him again. Mentally, she was sincerely grateful to her friend and agreed with her words. Having reached the right room, she stopped at the door, after which she knocked carefully several times, explaining that she had come to talk to the prince again. There was no answer, so Capella decided to call out to the guy and then pulled the door handle towards herself, declaring that she was entering. But what she saw shocked the girl. She screamed in fear. In front of her on the floor sat a prince. A sword was stuck in his chest, and there was blood around him. The guy was clearly not long for this world. But then the door opened again, and a woman's scream was heard. The maid, seeing such a picture, fell to the floor in fear, screaming at the top of her lungs. The girl, noticing Capella, assumed that she was the culprit. She immediately started shouting that she had nothing to do with it, but the servants did not listen and called the guards. When they arrived, the girl pointed at the main character to arrest her while she tried to prove her innocence, but no one listened. The men immediately grabbed Capella by the arms, squeezing them with all their strength and tying them behind her back. Raising her head, the heroine noticed out of the corner of her eye how the maids were whispering, looking at her detention. And then suddenly, she heard familiar sounds that made her eyes widen. Her friend Yuno walked in the corridor. She was wearing a hood. Noticing her, Capella tried to shout at the girl to attract her attention, but she seemed to ignore her, and the guards threw the heroine to the floor, ordering her not to move. All she could do was pitifully stretch out her hand towards the passage where her friend had just passed. For a moment, Yuno even turned around, as if looking at the heroine without much interest, but then she lowered her gaze again and walked on. Capella could not understand this at all. After some time, the main character was introduced to the king, who shouted at the top of his voice that Capella Axanon was sentenced to death for the murder of his son Oberon. She was kneeling before the man. Her hands were tied. The king ordered the guards to lock the heroine in prison until the day of her execution. Tears again appeared in the girl's eyes, and she tried to explain that she was not guilty. But out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a familiar silhouette. It was her father, his gaze cold and stern, as if he didn't care at all about his daughter. Capella screamed and begged him to help. She tried to convey that it was not her fault at all, but he only looked at her for a couple of seconds and turned away while she was dragged to the dungeon. The girl recalled that her father showed no interest in her, constantly ignoring her when she was a baby, although he was the only family in Capella. The man never even smiled at his own daughter, and she assumed it was because the people called him the Reaper of Death, Corvus Axanon. Slowly approaching her deathbed, Capella understood that such a father would hardly protect her. When the girl was already approaching the steps, the guards knocked her down, ordering her to tell her father her last words. Raising her head to him, the main character tried to convey that she had done absolutely nothing and was not guilty. But he silently looked at her with a cold and contemptuous gaze, and did not answer. Even in this position, the expression on his face did not change. The guards were preparing the guillotine. The clanking of chains was heard, and Corvus, without saying a word, turned around and walked away. Capella was shocked by her father's behavior and screamed, calling him with all her might. Frozen in a stupor, the main character realized that he really, apparently, hated her so much. Her head slowly fell onto the stand. The girl was being prepared for execution. Now she wanted one thing: to take revenge on her father, who did not give her the love she deserved all this time. Tears continued to flow down her cheeks. But then a familiar image and a woman's scream appeared in the crowd. Yuno rushed towards the main character, stretching out her hand to her, and then the guard suddenly cut the rope, after which a loud female scream was heard. The main character suddenly opened her red eyes, not understanding where she was and what was happening. She was in a bright room, and a bird was chirping on the window. Then a man appeared in the room, opened the door, and asked if Capella was awake. As he came closer, the girl recognized him as her father, only much younger, and she realized that he looked pretty cool in his youth. And then Capella suddenly raised her hands and saw that they had become insanely small. Only now did it dawn on her that she had suddenly become a baby, returned to the past, and the father slowly extended his hands to the child. The heroine looked at him with hostility, realizing that he was still her enemy, so she decided to act brilliantly. She grabbed his finger, which he extended to her. But the man was not angry. He called his daughter silly, and he thought that she looked like a real angel, while she still continued to hold his finger in her mouth. Capella could not understand, because her father said one thing and she heard other words. The man said to her face that it would be better if he had a son, and then she heard him praising her. And only then did it dawn on her that she seemed to be hearing her father's thoughts, which she should not have heard. This frightened the girl greatly, and she let go of his finger. The man did not openly declare that he was happy to have a daughter. On the contrary, he insisted that he wanted a boy more, but his thoughts were completely opposite. While the wind was blowing from the open window, and a blue bird was sitting on the windowsill and chirping, the father looked at the baby with interest. And then, leaning towards her and running his finger across her face, he declared that this girl could only be used for a political marriage. But in his head, he could not accept the fact that one day he would have to give his daughter in marriage. Then suddenly, a maid appeared in the room. The man immediately straightened up, and the girl immediately rushed to little Capella, while her father hastily left the room. The servants were worried that he could do something to the child, and the heroine realized that, as it turned out, she only heard the thoughts of one father. But it was hard for her to believe it, because he was always, and in any situation, extremely cold towards her. Everything around seemed to the girl like some kind of deception. Capella knew one thing, that she would definitely take revenge on him, although she didn't know yet how she would do it. But now, having received a second chance, she didn't dare give up. She thought that only Yuno was on her side. When the maid took her in her arms, the little girl was thinking about her own thing, that she had been given a second life for the sake of revenge. But that was not all, because she should have tried to avoid being executed. A year later, when little Capella learned to walk, she was already about to begin her insidious plan of revenge, and she was always accompanied by a little bluebird as the girl hurriedly made her way to her father's office. Opening the door slightly, the main character slyly looked into the room. The girl assumed that if the influence of the Axanon family fell, then her father would fall into the abyss of despair. She was going to do everything she could to prevent him from working in any way. But now he was extremely thoughtfully sorting through some papers, carefully walking into the room with his little feet. Capella realized that she should call him that way to completely piss him off. The little girl, loudly pacing around the office, called out loudly to her father, clearly saying "Papa," which immediately made him look up. Capella spread her arms wide and walked towards him with a smile on her face, expecting him to take her in his arms. He looked at his child in shock, as if he did not expect so many new actions from the child. especially that she called him Daddy, because these were her first words. So his heart just melted in front of such a picture. But he tried not to show it, awkwardly taking the child in his arms, looking at her with a gloomy expression on his face. The man only stated that his daughter was only a hindrance to him. After this, the little girl was shown the door, which immediately slammed shut in her little nose. Corvus raised his head proudly and thought that he had to work to protect his little angel. He wasn't going to sleep today. When Capella turned 3 years old, she was showing off her artistic skills. A woman, apparently a nanny, asked with a smile if the girl liked this activity. She, drawing a picture of the sun on paper, thought about how she would curse it. With a creepy smile, Capella thought about how she had seen this drawing in her past life, in the library of the mansion. And if she put it under her father's pillow, he would have nightmares. The drawing, of course, was not accurate, because she was not sure that she remembered everything correctly, but she tried to convey the meaning. The girl hoped that now her father would fall asleep forever. When the drawing was finally finished, Capella held it up in her little hands, admiring it as the birds circled around her, which the nanny noticed, smiling and saying that they were getting along well. The main character, throwing the bird into the air, announced that she had named the bird Ruri. After that, without a second's hesitation, the girl rushed to her father to take his drawing to his room. She remembered that Ruri, from the moment of her reincarnation, was really always next to her. She did not remember her in her past life. Entering the room, Capella reached over to the bed and tucked her drawing under her father's pillow, saying that one bird couldn't stop her from taking revenge. Now she just had to wait until nightfall. At night, armed with a fork, the main character went to her father's room, thinking that with her own hands she would not give peace to the man she hated. Opening the door slightly, Capella was about to attack her father, but saw that he was looking at her art. After that, a loud laugh of a man was heard, loud and creepy. This greatly frightened the girl, because she did not expect this at all, looking at the drawing, thinking that his daughter had drawn his portrait, and was embarrassed to hand it over personally. Laughing, the man thought about how to thank the little girl, because any title and wealth would pale in comparison to her. He was going to put this drawing in a frame. All his thoughts were about praising the young lady. Although he never said this out loud, the main character's head was literally cracking from her father's loud thoughts. Capella could not understand what kind of nonsense was going on in his head, and this laughter generally scared the girl a lot, so she decided to retreat and ran away. Just 2 years later, when Corvus, standing in front of the gate, looked at his daughter and explained that he was about to leave, she looked at him with her sweet eyes, fluttering her eyelashes. Noticing the girl's reaction, the man thought that she did not want him to leave. She only lived with the thought of how to take revenge on him, and then suddenly said that she wanted to ride a horse. Corvus refused. Then Capella, folding her hands in front of her face, looked straight into his soul with her sweet expression, which pierced him straight to the heart. Coughing, he nevertheless agreed. The father, in his heart, wanted to take his daughter for a ride on a horse, and for the little girl, it was another chance for her so-called revenge. The heroine wanted to hurt this man. Having put Capella on a horse, Corvus rode with her across the field. While she looked around so joyfully, such a reaction made him happy too, although he tried to show the opposite. While the girl was enjoying nature, her father suddenly casually started talking about finding her a groom. This information shocked her, making her freeze. The groom, of course, was the same second prince Oberon Kossar as in his previous life. As children, they often spent time together, drinking tea and many other things. But in the end, it turned out very badly for Capella. She was not allowed to get involved with him. That's why the little girl, waving her arms while sitting on the horse, screamed that she didn't want this at all. Then her foot slipped and hit the horse, causing the animal to jump, throwing its passengers off. Corvus managed to catch his daughter. He was lying on the ground, and on top of her, whom he was holding very tightly, the girl quickly jumped off, rushing to her father and shaking him. He instantly got to his feet and shouted loudly at the child. Calling the girl a fool, he told her never to twitch like that again while sitting on a horse, asking her to think about her safety. Now, for some reason, Capella did not hear her father's thoughts. He suddenly froze, and then turned away, explaining that he was very scared. He was glad that his daughter was safe. This surprised the girl. Now one thing was unclear. Why on that day, at the execution, the man didn't even look in her direction? Changing the subject, Corvus returned to the conversation about the engagement with Prince Oberon, asking if Capella was against it. She immediately nodded, showing that she did not like the idea. The man did not understand the reasons for the refusal, and then the main character, looking at her father, suddenly declared that she wanted to marry not the prince, but her father. And only after what was said did it dawn on her that what she had just said to him with her mouth was a very bad idea. He sighed and declared that his daughter's words were nonsense, but the man's thoughts were completely different. He himself wanted to marry his daughter. The next day, Corvus sat before Capella with a gloomy face, talking about how a parent cannot marry his daughter. In fact, he even specifically asked the king about this. Capella was amazed at her father's stupidity until he covered his face, either from displeasure or anger, and then handed his daughter a certificate of engagement to the second prince. The main character, taking it in her hands, opened her mouth in shock because she didn't want to find herself in that situation again. A few days later, Capella was already face to face with the little prince. He was smiling at her because he was glad to meet her. The girl could only sigh in irritation. She understood that even at such an age, he remained a handsome man. Oberon Quasar is the second prince of the Quasar Kingdom. He is the one who was known for his honesty and bright personality. This guy was the favorite fiancé of the main character. But then he suddenly decided to break off the engagement, and then Capella found him dead. That is why, from that moment on, the girl did not want to have anything to do with him anymore. The father pushed the main character towards the prince, while she was stubborn. Now she planned to forget about revenge for a while and take advantage of her father. And then the queen herself, Iris Khazar, appeared before them. She asked Corvus with a smile if he was being too protective of his daughter. Looking at the woman, the girl remembered that same grumpy old woman from the past. In her past life, it was Iris who taught the main character manners through yelling, and her father didn't even ask her to be a little kinder to her daughter. The woman, smiling, said that today was a special occasion, and no one dared to judge anyone. The young prince smiled joyfully at his little bride, and she, in turn, tried to avoid his company in every possible way. The queen invited Corvus and Capella to join them at a sumptuous table that was strewn with treats. The man immediately followed the advice, while the girl stood nearby. And then, tugging at her father's trousers, she looked him straight in the eyes, declaring that she wanted to sit on his lap. He waved it off, asking his daughter not to say any stupid things, while thinking that he would not let her get off the plane later, since she did all this on purpose. Capella watched the queen's reaction, because a girl who was so childish, would she be worthy of becoming the wife of the second prince? Thinking that now there would definitely be no engagement. But Iris only smiled happily, saying that everything was much better than she expected. The woman asked Corvus if the girl really loved her father so much. He answered with restraint. When Her Highness spoke about how, as a childhood friend, she was worried about him, Capella remembered that they had known each other for a long time. After all, Corvus was on the battlefield with her brother, who was also his best friend. So they knew each other from an early age and were often close. But Capella didn't need the queen at all. She considered her a terrible bitch and was furious. Even just sitting with her at the same table, the prince suddenly turned to the girl, asking what she liked to play. The boy suggested that his bride only preferred girly games and drawing, and the heroine thought about it, knowing that she didn't like that, and then suddenly declared that she loved horses. Iris was surprised that the young lady preferred horse riding to other activities, and this also surprised the prince. He thought that this was unusual for a girl. But then the main character disputed everything that was said at the table, saying with a smile on her face that she liked to play horse. After what was said, everyone at the table was surprised, and her fiancé decided to find out the details. Looking at Oberon, Capella asked the boy to suddenly become her horse. Of course, this was another plan of the main character to finally get rid of the royal family and her fiancé, because she had just said such rude things. They should have been angry with her. But then the young prince suddenly fell to the ground, getting on all fours in front of Capella, which she did not expect at all. She was shocked by such an act of the boy. The queen and Corvus immediately rushed to the young prince, asking him to stand up, and the father turned to his daughter, stroking her head. Looking at the main character, the man asked to say such things only to her father, but he himself thought that only he would be her horse. Such thoughts surprised the girl. And when Oberon sat down at the table again, he reminded his mother of how she had said that Capella could become his wife, and therefore he should take care of her and indulge her in everything. She agreed, and then looked at the girl. The heroine hoped that now everything would come to an end. But Iris suddenly turned to Corvus, talking to him about his work, forgetting about his daughter's actions. She couldn't understand why the queen suddenly changed the subject and why her plan didn't work. Corvus, taking the cup in his hands, said that now he decided to concentrate on the Duke's work, blaming everything on the fact that he was no longer at that age. The queen recalled how the man was interested in artifacts and remembered that he was only 25. Capella was ready to move on to physical measures. She looked at the young prince, trying to think of something, and then the boy suddenly exclaimed, calling Corvus the Reaper of Death, smiling. The conversation immediately died down. The man's face didn't change, but the queen looked at her son in shock. He beamed, asking the Duke if he had said his nickname correctly, since he had earned this title in the war. Without letting the prince finish speaking, Capella put on a show, pretending to fall and throwing a cup of tea right into the boy's face, leaving everyone around shocked. And Oberon sat silently, staring at one point. He clearly did not expect anything like this, sitting all wet and with drops of tea on his face and clothes. Capella was proud of herself and happily jumped up from her seat, hoping that at least now they would say something to her. But Iris smiled, even while apologizing for her son, which was very strange. Even Oberon was surprised when his mother suddenly asked him to apologize to Capella, since he himself was not guilty of anything, and then suddenly suggested ending their meeting for today. The main character could not understand why they suddenly started apologizing to her. The queen was beaming. It was clear that she liked the girl, but Capella could not understand how this had happened, realizing that what would happen next would be the same as in the past. Sitting in the carriage and heading home, the main character thought that at this rate she would be executed again, and this angered her. But suddenly, her father spoke to her. He abruptly picked up his daughter and sat her on his lap. She turned around and looked at him, because this was a strange and unexpected act. He looked at ease and explained that he did it because the carriage was shaking a lot. And then the heroine remembered her words about wanting to sit on his lap. But it was not clear to her why he suddenly mentally thanked her, and for what at all. At this time, the queen was walking with the prince along the path. She was clearly unhappy with her son's behavior, asking how he suddenly found out about the Reaper of Death. He tugged her dress and said that Carvus was very cool. Iris began to scold him, saying that the name had two meanings, but she was suddenly interrupted by the knight, who said that he had a message from Duke Ophelia. The man announced that a new candidate for the role of saint had been chosen, and upon hearing this, the queen turned around, and then the knight added that he would like to meet her. Iris asked what the name of that new candidate was, and the guy, remembering, said that it seemed her name was Juno. A few days later, in the living room of Axanon's house, the young prince begged for forgiveness at the Capella. She, looking at him, was interested in what exactly he was asking for forgiveness for. The boy explained that he was apologizing for his words towards her father, but the heroine thought that it was something else, because she had long forgotten about these words. The girl sighed and nodded, saying that she didn't remember anything, so there was no need to apologize. She wanted the prince to leave her alone and finally go home, but he beamed with joy and was delighted with Lady Capella's mercy, and then suddenly handed her some kind of envelope. Oberon smiled and explained that it was an invitation to his birthday. Hearing about this, Capella was horrified, because she had absolutely no desire to go there, but the prince assured her that it would be great there and she could come with her father. The boy's expression touched the heroine. On the appointed day, the main character and Corvus finally showed up for the party, and the man asked his daughter if the dress would suit her. She, laughing slyly, wished to come specially in such a simple dress, because she thought that the queen would be horrified, because she attended her fiancé's birthday in such clothes, but her father didn't care. For him, the most important thing was his daughter's comfort, although he thought that the dress was chosen exactly to match the color of his eyes. The girl was outraged by such thoughts and blurted out that it happened by accident because she was just trying to be fashionable. The man was surprised because he had not said anything out loud. And then, smiling, he remembered that her mother really liked this color. Hearing about this, Capella froze, and her cheeks turned red. Corvus declared that they were very similar, himself thinking about how great it would be if his beloved were next to them now. After this, the man left, asking his daughter to stay there, and he himself went to greet everyone, because he was suddenly overcome by loneliness, which he did not tell her about. Capella didn't understand why her father had suddenly turned away from her. Noticing the expression on his daughter's face, he turned around, asking if she wanted to tell him anything, but the girl only smiled and wished her father luck. And when she was finally alone, memories suddenly began to come back to her. Capella recalled a situation when a boy fell and injured his knee, and a girl helped him heal the wounds. And that girl was her best friend, Yuno. The same thing happened today. She was helping a boy with a wound. People gathered around them, watching the little capable lady in surprise, because many were seeing magic for the first time. Capella was overjoyed and beamed like the happiest person. She remembered that it was on this day that they became best friends and had just met. In some eras, miracle workers are born, who are called saints. They are able to use magic, which in ancient times only gods could use. The eras when saints are born are called eras of peace. Juno Ophelia is a saint and also Capella's best friend. She was always there for her when the heroine was sad. It was she who gave her the love that her father did not provide. Here, a boy pulled Capella out of her thoughts, poking her in the shoulder with his finger, pointing to the side and informing her that her fiancé was in the other direction. The main character, looking up shyly, thanked the stranger. He only smiled modestly in response, and then he was called out to and walked away. But to the girl he seemed very familiar. But now something else was much more important to her. Turning towards Yuno, she was about to head towards her, smiling happily and waving her arms. But then someone doused Capella with some kind of drink, staining her dress and leaving a huge wet spot. In front of her stood a girl in a bright orange dress, who apologized completely insincerely, explaining her actions by the fact that her hand suddenly slipped and it happened completely by accident, and then added that such a simple dress would not even be a pity to get dirty. Here, the main character remembered that in front of her now was the eldest daughter of the Duke Ophelia, Charla. Although Yuno is a beautiful and kind girl, her sister's character is the complete opposite. But in the past, right after that, Capella and Yuno were supposed to become friends, and she understood that if she did everything the same way, everything would work out. Until she suddenly noticed her father in the crowd, hearing his supportive thoughts. The girl could not understand because he was just looking at her, and she could already hear his every thought. He wanted his daughter to grow up independent. Corvus thought that Capella should become stronger. The heroine perceived all this as some kind of mockery at her, and this irritated her wildly, because he was the one who abandoned his daughter before her death. She didn't even want to hear something like that. So, taking a glass of drink, unable to resist, Capella angrily poured the liquid right onto Charla's dress, which she didn't expect at all, and stood in complete shock. The main character's eyes were shining with anger, smiling. The girl pretended to ask her rival for forgiveness, twirling the glass on her finger, and then, bending down, touched the girl's chin with her finger, and declared that the grimace of horror suited her much better. The heroine tried to convey to Charla that she had run into Capella Axanon, advising her to remember her name well for the future, promising to show her what the daughter of the Death Reaper is capable of. Capella stood proudly over the girl, smiling slyly while she remained silent. Here the young prince also noticed the commotion, and the father thought that his daughter had acted very coolly in this situation. Charla suddenly pretended to be very upset and crying, saying that Capella was very angry, adding that she did not want to do anything bad to her. Here Yuno intervened. Noticing that her sister was crying, she turned to her and asked what happened. She immediately began to complain about the main character. The saint raised her eyes to the main character, who panicked. Although she understood that she had already been caught red-handed and everyone had seen her act from the side, and the stain on her dress was not even visible because they were the same color. Looking at Yuno, Capella had absolutely no idea what to do. She thought that at this rate she would only hate her. First, immediately after the birth of the main character, her mother died, and she did not receive maternal love. And now, when she turned 5 years old for the second time, the girl made a fatal mistake. Her only friend in the past, Yuno, in her thoughts, will hate her in 5 seconds, and Capella will no longer have a friend. But then the girl suddenly asked if her sister, Charla, had been rude to her in any way, and the heroine breathed a sigh of relief, trying to explain that she had spilled juice on her, although she understood that she was the one looking like a villain now. Then Oberon's voice was heard approaching. He was clearly outraged and angrily asked why his bride was suddenly almost crying. Charla immediately began to justify herself and say that he had misunderstood everything and that Capella had spilled a drink on her dress. The heroine was trying to convey her truth. The prince saw that Charla's dress was noticeably damaged, but the main character's dress needed to be examined in more detail to be sure of everything. And then, unexpectedly, he dropped to one knee, grabbed the hem of Capella's dress, and began to sniff it, which greatly embarrassed the girl, because it was too much for her. But then Oberon looked up, saying that Capella's dress smelled like grape juice, and that she hadn't lied to anyone. And after these words, the young prince got into a big fight. Behind him was the queen, who was madly outraged by her son's actions. Because what kind of gentleman would expose a lady's legs in public? The boy immediately blushed, apologizing for his actions. Capella, embarrassedly covering her mouth with her hands, said that nothing terrible had happened, although she herself was shaking all over, and tears came to her eyes. Seeing this, the prince panicked. The queen said that both girls needed to change their clothes urgently, then turned to Corvus, asking if he was against it. He replied that he was not, and let the girls go change. Later, Oberon stood before Capella on his knees, begging her forgiveness for his stupid act, and she replied that she had already forgiven him long ago. The heroine now behaved like a real adult girl, realizing that there was a child in front of her now, and children tend to make mistakes. Suddenly jumping up, Oberon declared that he was ready to take responsibility for his actions. She, hearing this, blushed and exclaimed. When he took her hand, Capella could not understand what he was getting at, because they were already engaged. Remembering this, the prince promised that he would make his bride the happiest in the world. And then the main character remembered all the happy moments that she had with Oberon, how they, being joyful, rode horses. The girl understood how much she loved this guy. And then the moment when the prince refused the engagement came to mind. She understood that now in front of her was only a 6-year-old boy. This made her smile. Capella explained that she was the one who needed to apologize, because she was sorry that she had ruined his birthday, and he asked her not to worry about it. Then the heroine suddenly asked where the girl who was next to Charla was doing. Oberon asked if she was talking about the one who was recently adopted. He assumed that now they were both with their parents. After that, the heroine made a sad face, saying that she wanted to be friends with Yuno. After this, the young prince immediately took his bride by the hand, jerking it sharply and dragging her along with him. He smiled and ran forward, apparently trying to take the heroine somewhere, asking her to give him everything. The prince admitted that his mother considered Capella the best in the whole world and asked her son to protect her. Oberon stated that if the prince could not make his wife happy, then his people would not be able to do the same. These words greatly surprised the heroine. Turning to the girl, the boy asked her for only one thing. If she suddenly wanted to cry, then let her lean on him. Now, in front of her, she saw the same Oberon with whom she had once fallen in love. The boy promised that the heroine would never have to cry again, which he had personally sworn. Then they both suddenly stopped. The prince apologized, thinking that he had said something stupid, and Capella said that everything was fine, and she had a request. Wiping away tears from her face, the main character asked Oberon to call her simply by her name, Capella, and he smiled in response. And then he firmly took the girl's hand again and led her somewhere. She hoped that at least now she would be able to enjoy her first love to the fullest. The prince and Capella managed to catch up with Charla and Yuno with their parents, who were already leaving. He called out to the fair-haired girl, which made everyone turn around at once. Charla, noticing the boy, immediately beamed, and then she saw the main character, whose hand he was holding tightly, and this immediately made her lose her temper. The head of the family bowed to the prince, asking if the boy wanted anything from his new daughter. Oberon beamed and explained that his bride would like to befriend Lady Juno. Capella was shocked by the fiancé's directness. Their mother giggled happily, suggesting her own daughter, Charla, as a candidate for their friendship. She understood that even though the girls had recently quarreled, she tried to protect Charla, calling her a kind child, but she was clearly against her mother's idea, and the main character replied that it made no difference to her who she was friends with. Raising her head, Capella shyly asked Juno to be friends with her, and then nervously swallowed her saliva, worried about the girl's further answer. She looked down indifferently, and then wanted to ask the heroine one question. Did she want to be friends with her just because Juno was a saint? The answer was not long in coming. Capella explained that she wanted to be friends with her, as with an ordinary girl. These words greatly surprised her interlocutor. That's why Juno suddenly took the main character's hand, which surprised her. And then, smiling, she said that she would be very glad to be friends with Capella. These words made the girl shine with joy. After a while, the family's carriage moved off, Juno waving at her new friend through the window, while Charla was very angry at her sister. The girl's parents looked strange. Their smiles were terribly forced, and they were clearly unhappy about something. But then, a few seconds later, Juno received a blow to the face from a hand that was so strong that blood began to flow from the girl's mouth. Her sister stood over her in anger, screaming and trying to find out if Juno wanted to get closer to the prince in this way, since she agreed to be friends with that girl. The parents did nothing. The mother, on the contrary, smiling, said that if they had dressed the mouse better, she would have been able to charm someone. Here the father joined in, stepping with all his might on his adopted daughter's hand, causing her to scream loudly in pain. He insisted that even mice could be useful, since they wanted to gain access to Axanon's weakness in this way. A couple of days later, Capella was already busy with an invitation for her new friend. She really hoped that this time she would be able to become friends with Juno. Showing the invitation she had just drawn to Grace, the girl asked if she had done a good job, and Grace, smiling, replied that it was her best work, and the woman even offered to show it to Capella's father, which greatly upset the girl. When the main character came to him, he, looking at the invitation, suggested inviting Oberon too, and he himself wondered whether she would ever write him a similar letter. The man explained that Capella was only able to befriend Juno thanks to Oberon, so he believed that the young prince also deserved an invitation. In front of his daughter, Corvus held back his positive emotions and tried to get her out the door as quickly as possible, because if she stayed longer, his face would break into a stupid smile. Hearing these thoughts, the girl hurried to leave. As she walked slowly down the corridor, Capella realized that Oberon had made her heart flutter the other day, and she hadn't even realized it right away. Remembering his image, the girl suggested that perhaps it would be better for them not to get closer. In other words, despite him, the main character was not going to change her plan for revenge. Now she needed to prepare a chic tea party for her friend. On the appointed day, Capella literally flew from her room down the stairs. She was going to prepare a luxurious tea party. And at that moment, the girl thought that the treasury would be useful to her. After a few minutes, she was standing in front of the entrance there. Capella literally lay down on the door, so that it would give way a little so that she could enter inside. And she succeeded. The heroine stood at the entrance, looking at huge cabinets with various treasures. After all, in order for the tea party to go well, she was going to use the precious tea set from their treasury. Her hands were already slowly reaching for one of the plates. But then her father suddenly pulled her away, appearing literally out of nowhere. Corvus was yelling at his daughter because no one should touch the artifacts with bare hands, because if they touched it, everything around could explode. Capella lowered her head guiltily, quietly apologizing for her stupidity. The man knew that it was his own fault because he had not looked after his child. The main character quietly asked if this plate was an artifact. He answered that it was, adding that everything in this room was an artifact. Looking around the room, the heroine was genuinely surprised, which Corvus did not understand, asking if she had really forgotten what house she was in. And then he realized that he had not told her before. And then Capella realized that this was her chance to find out her father's secret. She had a plan in her head. The girl made a sweet face and said that she didn't know about it. This face broke her father's fragile heart, lowering himself to his daughter. Corvus said that he would tell her. He asked the girl if she knew what artifacts were, and she pouted and said that she did. Young Capella decided to demonstrate her knowledge, telling that the artifacts are relics that have been found for the last 100 years. They say they were made using a craft called magic, which has long since ceased to exist, and they have superpowers. Smiling, the heroine summed up that modern technology cannot recreate them, but the knowledge from the past was clearly useful to her now. The man confirmed her words, adding that the plate she wanted to take was capable of removing poison from any food, and he himself thought that his daughter was a real genius, and then asked if the girl knew anything about the great ducal families that are associated with divine powers. Capella immediately thought of Juno, her best friend, who was straight from Ophelia's house. Corvus agreed, explaining that their family was in charge of collecting and storing artifacts. Looking at his daughter, the father added that Ophelia's family is the upbringing of saints. Their two families are the pillars that support the kingdom of Quasar. This information really surprised the main character, because she did not expect this. Stroking Capella on the head, Corvus noticed her smile, said that she was happy in vain, and then asked her to never come here again, throwing the girl out the door. So she remained standing in front of the huge door, digesting everything that her father had just told her. And then she screamed loudly, not knowing where to put the stake for Juno. On the day of the tea party, Capella dressed up in a smart dress and then began to interrogate Grace. Asking if the sweets were ready, she replied that everything had been prepared for a long time. The woman wondered how the little girl knew about such a good store, where they bought everything for today. The heroine knew that in the past, this establishment had become wildly popular, but then their discussion was interrupted. A maid fell at their feet, breaking a vase of flowers, and she immediately began to ask the young mistress for forgiveness. Capella, in turn, extended a helping hand to her with a smile, asking if the girl was hurt. She began to stutter. The girl thought that she had hurt her hand and said that it needed to be bandaged. Then she turned to Grace, asking if they had any spare flowers. The woman, smiling warmly, replied that, of course, flowers would be found. The heroine could not understand such a reaction. But then Grace, for some reason, started talking about the girl's mother. Continuing to smile, she suggested that if the mother saw Capella now, she would be very proud of her daughter. Hearing this, the girl became very embarrassed, and then tried to change the subject, returning to the vase. When Grace wanted to leave, the fallen maid called out to her, saying that the master had said that if there were not enough dishes, then they could take them from the treasury. This greatly surprised the woman. The maid was noticeably nervous after her words, and looked after the woman for a long time, while Capella kept thinking about the words about her mother. After all, before the girl really was much angrier, but remembering everything that the heroine went through in her life and what she saw, a lot changes. She didn't want to hurt anyone anymore. She held her bird friend carefully, looking at him tenderly, and then Capella suddenly wondered why Grace was so late. And only now did she remember that in the past, when the heroine was little, the woman was suddenly fired. At least that's what they said. The girl constantly tried to ask her father about the reasons for the dismissal, and not only him, but no one told the truth, or simply did not want to. She disappeared just on that day. Noticing the thoughtful heroine, one of the servants approached her, asking if everything was okay with her, and if the girl wanted to go back to her room. She became nervous, remembering that in the past, everyone was also busy preparing for tea. But then suddenly, there was a loud explosion that frightened everyone around. The tea party itself had suddenly been cancelled, and everyone had been dispersed by Corvus. So now that Capella thought about it, she remembered her father's mention of the dishes in the treasury that could explode on contact. Now, having put everything together, the girl realized that something terrible had happened to Grace that day, and she immediately rushed into the building. Tears immediately appeared in Capella's eyes. The heroine ran as fast as she could and shouted the woman's name, hoping that she could save her from something terrible. But when the girl ran into the building, she saw Grace in the middle of the corridor, who was looking at her with a smile and asking why her mistress suddenly started screaming. She could not understand why the girl was so surprised. And then she explained to Capella that the gentleman said that he would bring a replacement for the vase himself, and she herself was just returning back to her. Then the heroine panicked even more. After all, if we leave everything as it is now, Corvus will suffer from a strong explosion and maybe even die. As Grace was heading to get the vase, the man stopped her, saying that he would bring it himself. She was very surprised by this. He replied that his daughter had been interested in artifacts the other day, so he was going to bring them something safe. After that, he left, thinking about how he yelled at Capella last time and was going to bring her the artifact as an apology. Corvus was surprised by one thing. The girl, without receiving a proper education, turned out to know a lot. Standing in front of the door to the treasury, he reasoned that this could be used so that his daughter could learn more about artifacts. After Grace said that her father had said that he would bring the vase himself, a picture immediately appeared in the girl's head of him opening the door and everything around exploding. Capella froze, realizing that given what had happened in her past life, there would be an explosion in the mansion, and Grace would have to die in it. But now it would be her father. Horrible images appeared in her head. Corvus, who was slowly being engulfed in flames, and if nothing was done now, he would die there. Panic suddenly gripped the girl. She grabbed her dress, on the one hand, realizing that her revenge would finally come to an end, and in her life there will no longer be a cold and cruel father. Capella will become a free man. But the main character suddenly remembered all those thoughts of her father that she had managed to hear personally, how he tried for the sake of his daughter, tried to work more and look cool in front of her. Having thought it all over, Capella clenched her fists and ran forward, leaving Grace standing alone and bewildered. The girl rushed to her father with all her might, not understanding why he had been so cold to her then, although in fact, he loved her so much. The heroine ran so fast that she didn't care that she was literally tumbling down the stairs in order to make it in time to save Corvus. She wanted him to tell her everything first, hoping that at least in this life she could make him not hate her. Remembering her father, bitter tears appeared in the girl's eyes. She kept telling herself how much she supposedly hated him, even though she rushed to help him. Capella mentally ordered him not to die until she got to him, because the heroine wanted revenge to be accomplished by her hands, while he at that time held the door handle with his hand, slowly opening the door. Then Capella appeared behind the man, calling him loudly, to which he immediately turned around, noticing his daughter. It was at this moment that Corvus opened the door, and it turned out that the girl and her bird literally flew into the room, in which a loud explosion immediately thundered. Grace immediately appeared at the sound, panicking and asking what the noise was. In front of her, the woman saw her owner and his daughter, who was covered in blood and unconscious. The man was also injured, but was conscious. He immediately grabbed the girl in his arms, shouting to Grace that they were going to Ophelia's house right now. He didn't care what that family would demand. It was important to him that the saint could heal Capella. The woman, worried, asked the gentleman not to strain himself so much, since he had also suffered from the explosion. But he responded by shouting, declaring that he did not care about himself. Now the most important thing for him was to save the life of his daughter Capella, who was unconscious. Looking at the little girl, the man remembered all the moments from her childhood and understood that if he lost her now, he would not be able to survive it. Then someone's squeak was heard under his feet. It was Capella's bird. Corvus asked to cure it too, remembering how much his daughter treasured this creature. Grace, hearing about this, was shocked. Looking at the main character, while blood was running down his face from his forehead, he declared that this bird was also part of their family. The small blue creature lay half dead on the floor, occasionally showing signs of life. Grace carefully took her in her hand, and Corvus asked her to hurry, and that she ask for the carriage to be prepared right now. But then the butler ran to them to tell the news. The man stated that Ophelia's family had already arrived at their mansion, and that there would be no need to eat anywhere. Corvus, continuing to hold his daughter's body in his arms, only silently looked at the man. Compared to her past life, Capella believed that everything was different in this life. She has her bird Ruri, Grace helps her a lot in absolutely everything. Also, Capella can hear the thoughts of her own father. However, the heroine's end remains the same. Death, apparently, is her destiny, but she could not understand what exactly she had done to deserve such a fate, and if she did manage to survive, she would not be able to change anything, because her father would turn away from her again, and she would die. Then someone intervened in her thoughts, someone's voice. The main character jumped out of bed abruptly, Waking up from sleep, the first thing she saw was her father sitting next to her. He, realizing that his daughter had woken up, immediately pulled the girl into his arms, quietly calling the heroine a sleepyhead. Holding her tightly in his arms, he whispered almost into Capella's ear that 3 years was too long. And upon hearing this, the girl opened her eyes in shock. 3 years earlier, when Yuno agreed to help cure her friend Capella, diligently using all her powers to heal her wounds. When all the scratches and wounds disappeared, the girl moved away from the heroine a little, tired and all in sweat, saying that she had managed to heal all the wounds. But the father was interested in one thing: when his daughter would wake up. Yuno turned around, apologized, and explained that she did not know this. After these words, the Duke looked at her with malice, which made the poor girl shake with horror. The foster mother pulled her close, asking Duke Axanon not to look at her daughter with such a look, because even though she was a saint, she was now only 5 years old. In addition, the woman reminded the man of his promise. He looked at her with a frowning look, without answering. Holding Yuno in her arms, with a smirk on her face, the woman stated that Corvus would have to pay them back for their kindness, and he clenched his fists and responded in the affirmative. Prince Oberon was also present in the room. Corvus gently placed his hand on his shoulder, asking him to tell his father about everything that had happened between them. The boy, raising his head to the man, said that if he could do anything for Capella, then let her father just say so. Hearing this, he opened his eyes in surprise. Lady Ophelia intervened in the conversation, asking if the head of the family needed to be treated as well. Corvus refused, turning to Grace, who was carrying a small bird in her arms towards them. For the man, after the life of his daughter, the life of her little friend was now important. The woman, noticing the bird, immediately nodded to her adopted daughter, who only agreed to carry out her mother's order. Grace brought all these events to chapel. As soon as the girl opened her eyes, she was already 8 years old. When the woman said that the main character was saved by Mrs. Yuno, she literally beamed with joy, admiring her friend, but did not know how much money she would have to pay back to this family now. On the one hand, Capella thought about the fact that they were a family and not a poor one, and then suddenly decided to ask Grace who was behind that explosion. Without turning around, the woman reminded the girl about the girl who dropped a vase of flowers in front of them that day, which shocked the heroine. Capella could not understand the reason for the act, because that day she forgave her. The girl asked what happened to her in the end. Without wanting to scare the little girl, Grace, smiling, clapped her hands, saying that her father had already sorted everything out long ago, so she had nothing to be afraid of at all, and then abruptly changed the subject. The woman said that Capella could ask for anything, because she was still recovering. The girl listened briefly, slowly turning her head towards the familiar sounds. On the floor in front of her bed, her favorite bird was carefully walking around, cheerfully chirping to its owner. The main character was shocked that her father asked to cure Ruri along with her. It was surprising, because in the past life where he abandoned her, there was no bird at all, but she still was not going to give up on revenge after such a touching act. At night, when Capella was going to sleep, her father was sitting on a chair near the bed, reading a book. The girl could not understand why he was there at all, so she called out to him, after which he began to admire his daughter's voice, which he missed so much. She looked at him tensely and asked why he was still in her bedroom. Corvus sighed, asking if there was a reason for that, and the thoughts in his head explained the situation. Because he slept all 3 years in his daughter's bedroom, such information wildly confused the heroine and surprised her at the same time, because he even worked in this room and waited and waited. The man asked her not to worry because he did not sleep on her bed, but simply watched. The girl was indignant, because if you stay in this position all the time, your back will hurt. The father asked again whether Capella really wanted him to lie down next to her, and she became indignant, not understanding why he had come to such a conclusion. While he was looking at his daughter, in his head, there were only thoughts about how he would sleep next to her, guarding her sleep. She, embarrassed, said that today she could very well lie next to him, but Corvus did not agree, because he thought that after that the girl would hate him. Nervously, Capella blurted out that she wanted her father to sleep with her today. Upon hearing this, he immediately closed his book and climbed onto the bed, put out the candle, and then lay down. Turning on his side, The man closed his eyes, wishing his daughter good night, while she looked extremely embarrassed, and he was simply happy. But then, out of the corner of her eye, Capella noticed how her father was trembling. He was still thinking about the joyful event, about the fact that his beloved daughter was alive and well. The heroine suddenly quietly rose up on the bed, continuing to look in his direction. She kept asking herself why on that day her father simply looked at her during the execution. The girl blamed herself, thinking that she had done something wrong, because no matter how much time passed, the image of him turning his back on her would not leave her head. Capella lay back down on the bed, turning her back to Corvus, closed her eyes and fell asleep peacefully. She wondered if her father could hear the voice of her heart, how he would react then. Corvus sat at the table, holding the instruments in his hands and looking ahead with a stern and displeased look. Sitting in front of him was already 9-year-old Capella, who could not understand what she had suddenly done wrong. The man declared that there was a very urgent matter to discuss. The main character was frightened, fearing that His Highness Oberon had already been killed and that she would now be blamed for his death. But the father, continuing to incinerate his daughter with his gaze, declared that he would have to go on a long business trip. All these years he sat at home and did not go anywhere, even on the orders of the king, and he himself thought about the fact that he could not leave his daughter alone. Corvus explained that he could no longer ignore the emperor, and that if he ignored orders, it would be considered treason, which meant that Capella would have to be left alone, which angered him. He even thought about killing the king and putting his daughter on the throne, and many other thoughts came to him. Listening to this, the girl's head was literally boiling. The girl covered her ears with her hands and screamed that she also wanted to go with him, asking him only to stop this stream of thoughts. Hearing this, he froze in surprise. Looking at his daughter, apparently, he was waiting for her to suggest this to him. After some time, Capella was already sharing the news with her friend Yuno, who was happy for her. The heroine was stressed about this trip because she would not be able to see her friend for 3 months. She managed to start communicating with Yuno after her coma, because in her past life she did not waste 3 years, and Oberon brought the savior to his bride that day. The boy suggested that the girls meet regularly, and they were surprised by this proposal. Since then, they have become quite good friends and meet once a month, sitting at the same table, but, for some reason, in the royal palace. Yuno thought that Capella's upcoming trip was a good idea, saying that it was much better than staying at home aimlessly, but she reminded him that her father was going there for work after all. Then the prince spoke up, saying that 3 months was quite a long time, and the heroine only sighed in response, and then explained that something else needed to be prepared before the trip, so it would only take 2 months. Oberon smiled warmly and awkwardly stated that he would miss Capella, who, hearing this, became embarrassed. But she tried to control herself, reminding herself that in the future, this man would leave her. The prince had a brilliant idea, smiled, and said that when Capella returned, they should go somewhere together. After this joyful statement, the girls looked at each other and then declared that this was a very good idea. On the appointed day, Corvus and Capella rode in the same carriage, and she looked at her father with great surprise. After all, he, in turn, had changed a lot over the past years. Seeing how his daughter looked at him, he looked up, thinking that she was bored. Clutching a piece of paper in his hand, he tried to think of something to talk about with his little daughter, going through different options, wondering if she was in love with anyone. But then Corvus suddenly lowered the unfortunate piece of paper, thinking that he did have one idea after all. Taking off his glasses, the man asked Capella if she knew why they were suddenly leaving. In fact, he felt sorry that his father could only talk about such boring things. The girl was happy with any topic. The main thing for her was that she didn't hear his strange thoughts, at least a little. The heroine suggested that some artifact had recently been found, and her father needed to examine it. He nodded, saying that everything was correct, and mentally praised his daughter. He shared that artifacts are most often found in excavations, and where one is found, you can find more. He was interested in whether his daughter understood why this happens. The girl didn't know. She sat with a thoughtful face and looked at her father. He found her puzzled look very cute. Capella suggested that this was because the ancestors threw everything out together. Hearing this, Corvus smiled. Placing his hand to his chin, the man thought this was a very good idea. For them, Artifacts are like real treasures. The gods created them as tools for everyday life. This is the most common theory. Corvus said that it is believed that gods once lived on their land, and the places where artifacts are found may have been their settlements, so perhaps that is why they are found together. Capella was very fascinated by such stories, and she became truly interested in how the gods lived in the past. Apparently, the father was very impressed by his daughter's sincere interest, because he froze, looking at her admiring face. But he quickly came to his senses, coughing, explaining that they were about to go excavate these very artifacts, and besides, it was the king's order, and they couldn't disobey him. But then something happened outside, causing the carriage to shake violently, and Capella immediately became frightened. The man immediately pressed his daughter as close to him as possible, asking about what was happening outside. He tried to shout to someone, and the coachman shouted for them not to get out of the carriage. After this, stones suddenly flew into the windows of the transport. The main character began to scream in fear, trying to dodge the stones. The girl looked out the window and saw how the carriage was being guarded by knights, driving away the strange people who had surrounded it. They looked very angry and were clearly ill-disposed towards this family because they had weapons in their hands. The knights continued to drive the crowd away from the carriage, keeping them at a distance. The father put his arm around his daughter in concern, ordering her not to leave the vehicle under any circumstances. Corvus himself came outside, showing himself to the angry crowd, asking them to tell him directly what had happened. The man ordered the guard to put away his weapon and allow him to go to the crowd to calmly discuss the problems that had arisen. One of the men immediately rushed at Corvus, grabbing him by the collar. He was outraged that he had sold out their lives. A woman in the crowd, hugging a weakened child, shouted that he had sold this territory for the life of his daughter. The man kept tugging at the gentleman's collar. Everyone around him was shouting in anger, blaming him for everything that was happening to them. Corvus pulled the stranger's hand away, then turned around and asked the guards to do something with these people. But then a guy wanted to rush to the Duke. The knights immediately blocked the passage. He, crying, tried to find out from the Duke why he sold them and abandoned them so mercilessly. Corvus didn't answer, silently climbing into the carriage, while Capella looked at him with a shocked look. He looked down at the floor, mentally apologizing to the people, because there was no other way to save his daughter. Capella understood that this village was under the jurisdiction of their family, but she couldn't understand why everything had changed now. Corvus replied that it was, but now it was under the control of the Ophelia family. The heroine understood that in order for Juno to treat her, her father gave this territory to their family. Looking up at Corvus, Capella quietly suggested that all this was done just to keep her alive. The main character suddenly jumped up from her seat and ran to the exit. She understood that she should at least apologize to the poor and innocent people. But on the way out, her father immediately grabbed her, saying that it didn't concern her at all. People's hands were already reaching out to the girl. They all looked extremely exhausted, and perhaps thirsty for revenge on the culprit, stretching out their hands to her to drag her to themselves. The Duke understood that his daughter had nothing to do with this. He dragged his daughter back into the transport, realizing that this was only his personal decision, and he ordered the coachman to leave here as quickly as possible. The carriage set off, leaving behind the villagers, who were extremely angry and disappointed in the Duke, who understood that he only had himself to blame for everything. Capella lowered her eyes guiltily. Looking at the floor, her father did not break the silence. He was tormented by his own thoughts. Having driven a little further, turning around, the main character noticed a pile of snow on the street through the window. They finally reached the snow city called Albatron. Getting out of the transport, Capella, even in warm clothes, was very cold, while her father apparently did not care about the cold. The girl looked at him. He thought about it and realized that he shouldn't have taken his daughter with him to such a cold city. She immediately assumed that he would now think about how boring it would be here. Capella suddenly grabbed her father by the sleeve, stopping him. He stood rooted to the spot. Surprised by this, the girl asked if this was their destination. Smiling sweetly at Corvus, the heroine declared that the city was very beautiful, which amazed the man even more. They stood in the middle of the road, looking at everything around them. The lanterns were on, the road was covered with snow, and there were miniature houses all around. Turning to the girl, he stroked her hat. confirming her guess. Now Corvus was glad that his daughter liked it here. She looked at him with a smile. While they stood and looked ahead, an unfamiliar voice was heard from behind, which stated that they had not seen the Duke for a long time. Turning around, they saw a man with a mustache standing in front of them, who greeted the girl. He bowed and explained that he was in charge of governing the city of Albatrog, and then turned to introduce another person. Capella looked ahead in surprise, apparently recognizing the person being introduced to her. In front of her was the boy who was at the prince's birthday party. His name was Raquel Gordsky. Extending his hand to the girl, Raquel said that he very much hoped that he could become like a brother to Capel. The main character looked at him in surprise, not rushing to extend her hand in response. She was apparently very stunned. Capella was in no hurry to answer, as if trying to digest the information. She was surprised by the boy's phrase that he would become like a brother to her. Frightened, Capella rushed to her father. Clinging to him, she was afraid, because in her past life, this had never happened. Corvus turned to her and smiled. He was very pleased that his daughter was calmer with him. Raquel came closer, trying to remind the heroine that they met at the prince's birthday party. Capella remembered this, but tried to rummage through all the memories in her head to understand if he was somewhere else. Still hiding behind her father, the girl realized that she had never seen Raquel anywhere else in her past life, except at the prince's birthday party. Corvus thought he wanted his daughter to forget all the guys she knew and remember only her father. The man suddenly turned to Raquel, thinking that he had long since given up on the idea of adoption. The boy explained that his father had a completely different opinion. He explained that when they learned that Duke Axanon was coming, he was forcibly sent to meet them. The chapel, hearing this, was surprised, assuming that they were talking about the fact that the father had no son and needed a successor. Corvus, looking at Raquel, asked where Lord Gordsky was now. He replied that he was inspecting the local market. The man asked the mayor to accompany him to the excavation site. He began to assume that Corvus was very tired from the journey and wanted to rest. But he disputed this. He did not want to stay here for long. Taking Capella by the hand, they went to the right place. The man understood that very soon they would return home. There were some very strange thoughts in his head that were really stressing his daughter out. Having reached the right place, Corvus learned the details of the artifact's location. The mayor pointed to a high mountain, saying that the previous Duke Axanon had already examined this place. The man stated that he found it very difficult to believe that anything could have been missed during the examination. Suddenly, Capella's voice was heard. The girl was indignant that her father, for some reason, was holding her in his arms. He explained that it would be difficult for her to walk in the snowy mountains. Raquel was with them. Corvus looked at the boy with disdain. He didn't want him to touch his daughter with even a finger. Not far away, someone's thin voice was heard, similar to the voice of a little girl, and everyone immediately turned towards the sound. It was Charla, who was being carried in the arms of an unknown man, apparently one of her servants. The girl called out to Raquel, grinning slyly. A spark immediately passed between the girls, which almost turned into lightning. The situation between them was tense. Capella, baring her teeth, was displeased because she had managed to forget about her during all this time. She remembered her as Yuno's sister, who was always getting into trouble. Capella considered Charla her sworn enemy and was not happy about this meeting. She mocked her, thinking that she still could not walk without her father. The girl got off the servant's hands, proudly standing in front of the heroine, declaring that they were different because she had come here with her father purely for work. Smiling, Charla stated that Albatron was her city, and since Capella and her father were here for the first time, she wished them to enjoy the place to the fullest. The girl admitted that she doesn't understand anything about managing the territory, but she likes it here because it's so beautiful around. Capella got scared, realizing that perhaps everything was the same with this city as with that village. And then Charla suddenly turned to Duke Atkinson, asking if he should greet the host immediately upon his arrival. She felt a certain superiority over them. He, holding his daughter in his arms, bowed carefully, apologizing to his hostess, although he himself considered it a waste of time. The man asked if she wanted to accompany them on the excavations. Smiling, Charla replied that yes, because she didn't want anyone to cause mischief on her territory. Corvus looked down, stating that they should finish quickly then, so that she wouldn't catch a cold. Capella, seeing the expression on her father's face, was visibly frightened, because it was the first time she had seen him so frightening. Charla pestered Raquel, grabbing him by the sleeve of his coat and asking him to take her hand, and he had no choice but to silently agree, although he clearly did not want this. But then, turning his head, the boy accidentally met Capella's gaze, freezing in place and looking into her eyes for a couple of minutes, and then blushing like a tomato. Charla, noticing this, was very angry, because once again the heroine attracted more attention to herself, as she did at the birthday party, because the boys preferred her company more. The heroine suddenly pressed herself against her father again, squinting her eyes. She did not understand why everything had become so complicated. Corvus, holding his daughter closer, thought that he would definitely protect her. After some time, he lowered his daughter down, asking her to wait for him here, because an avalanche could happen at any time, and he wanted to inspect the excavation site himself. He left an unusual decoration for his daughter, putting it in her hands. She looked at it in surprise. It looked beautiful and bright. Turning around, Corvus asked Raquel to stay outside as well, but he followed the man, declaring that he would also go with him. The main character looked at the pendant with a smile, thinking about how much her father was really protective of her. Then, Charla was heard behind her, smilingly calling the decoration a nice antique, and Capella turned around and asked what she wanted from her. The heroine stood practically on the edge, and Charla came closer and closer to her, asking the girl if the prince was not enough for her, since she was looking at Raquel. The girl, smiling, declared that people like Capella should be punished, and then suddenly stretched out her arms, pushing the heroine down. The girl opened her eyes in fear, not believing that Charla had actually done this, because she really was flying down the cliff. Hearing the screams, Corvus and Raquel turned around in fear, not understanding what had happened. Charla immediately turned on the actress, saying that Capella had tripped and fallen. The girl, looking up at her, could not believe that she had the audacity to lie. Here, Charla pulled Raquel away, ordering her not to scream, apparently so as not to cause an avalanche. But then the main character's bird started to fuss, chirping loudly and flying around, as if panicking, and not in vain, because at that time an avalanche began to descend, which was heading straight for the chapel and threatened to take it away. Hearing a suspicious sound, the men looked up to see everything around them shaking. Corvus immediately remembered his daughter, realizing that she was now in danger, so he rushed to her. But then the passage to the cave was blocked by snow. The man barely dodged it to avoid getting hit, and then rushed to clear it as quickly as possible. The mayor was talking about how they should call for help because they couldn't cope alone. Corvus, shoveling away piles of snow, kept saying that he didn't have time for that, after which he stopped, putting his hand in his inside pocket. From there, he took out some strange decoration, where in the middle there was a large red stone. It glowed. Apparently it was magical, and the man understood that there was no other way out. When he pointed the decoration at the passage, the snow suddenly seemed to evaporate, clearing the exit, and a red light was burning around. The mayor shouted that using the artifact without approval was dangerous, because it could lead to another avalanche. Corvus didn't listen. He ran forward, shouting his daughter's name, hoping to see her ahead, but immediately froze when she wasn't there. But the man saw a shaking pile of snow. He assumed that this was where his daughter was, and immediately rushed to her aid, digging through the snow pile. But underneath it was not Capella, but Charla's escort, who covered the hostess and Raquel with his body. When the bully stood up, the girl shook her dress in irritation, talking about how terrible the situation was. But the boy was calm, while his companion insisted that if she had known that this would happen, she would not have gone anywhere. Corvus was beside himself with anger. He looked at Charla, asking where his daughter was now. The girl, confused, rushed to Raquel, thinking that he would protect her. He stood motionless, even more irritated by the fact that the girl rushed towards him, and, in general, her company. Here, Charla's escort intervened in the conversation, saying that he was very sorry because his mistress had pushed Capella before the avalanche began, and that was why he was able to protect her. When she heard him blurt out everything to the Duke, the girl was stunned and indignant. Before Corvus could react, his daughter's bird suddenly appeared above them, chirping loudly and attracting attention. Everyone looked up. and the bird itself rushed to the owner's father, grabbing him by a lock of hair with its beak, as if trying to take him somewhere. Without thinking twice, he agreed and followed it. Charla started shouting after him, asking him to stop and waving her hand. The girl believed that since she was the main one in this city, a man could not do anything here without her presence. But then Rickle intercepted her hand. He was very irritated, and it was noticeable from his facial expression. Looking into her eyes, the boy angrily asked her to be quiet for a little while. She suddenly fell to her knees in front of him, asking why he was behaving like this towards her, while Corvus ran to help his daughter. The man literally rushed into the abyss in a matter of seconds, not fearing for his life, worrying only about his beloved daughter. Raquel, watching this, smiled, thinking that he definitely wanted to become a family with these people. The boy thought that it would definitely not be boring with them, while his father flew down after Capella with her bird. At that time, the decoration that her father left her suddenly began to shine on the main character's neck, and the earth around her shook from the approaching avalanche. A strange blue glow suddenly appeared around Capella, and after a couple of minutes, she opened her eyes in confusion. The girl was lying in the snow, and in the snow there was a strange circle, like a ritual one, from which a bright light emanated. She was surprised that she remained intact. Seeing an incomprehensible barrier nearby, she stood up, trying to touch it with her finger. But after the heroine touched it, it suddenly cracked, flying into pieces. The jewel cracked right before Capella's eyes, still continuing to adorn the girl's neck. Taking the decoration in her hands, she saw that it was finished. Everything was cracked. The heroine panicked, not knowing what to do. She thought that this thing was very, very expensive, and because of this, their family would go bankrupt. An idea came to her mind: to collect the treasure piece by piece. Taking one of the pieces, Capella looked closely, realizing what a beautiful stone it was. Rising from the ground, the girl suddenly realized how cold it was here. Adjusting her hat, the heroine realized that she needed to somehow find her way back, and then suddenly heard loud and strange sounds from above. Before she could even raise her head, a little further away from her, something or someone loudly plopped down into the snow. The heroine immediately ran to that place. Here she was met by Ruri, who began to circle above her head, chirping happily. Capella was incredibly happy to see her bird friend. She was glad that she was okay. Then a familiar voice was heard, and then the girl saw the top of her father's head in a snowdrift. She immediately began to call him, and he was incredibly happy to hear his living daughter, while she frantically dug out his head. When she finally managed to do it, she saw his head in front of her. He immediately asked if the girl was okay. Capella, panicking, screamed and asked, ignoring his question, if her father himself was okay, because she was clearly worried about him. When Capella finally dug her father out of the snowdrift after a long time, she then collapsed tiredly to the ground, and he apologized to her. Noticing how it was starting to get dark, the man took the girl in his arms, saying that it was time for them to return to the city. The heroine was embarrassed. She clearly didn't like being in his arms. Corvus closed his eyes, asking his daughter to be silent, and said that he would not even listen to complaints. And when he took a step, he realized that he had apparently seriously injured his leg when he fell, but he didn't show it, thinking about how best to do it. He wanted to reach the cave first, but then he overcame himself and convinced himself that he could carry Capella to the city even with his sore leg. Corvus mentally promised himself to protect his beloved daughter at all costs. Listening to all these thoughts, the heroine felt a little awkward. Suddenly, the words burst out of her mouth. "Dad is a fool." He immediately looked at her with a stern gaze, and he himself became even more worried, thinking that she was hungry. He even wanted to start hunting a bear in order to feed her. But then Capella blurted out that everything was fine, so that her father would stop worrying. The girl thought about what an idiot he was. Corvus nevertheless brought the heroine into the cave, thanking his legs for not letting him down, at least for such a distance. It was too dark to go further. Having seated his daughter, the man took 2 stones, as if trying to make a fire. The girl immediately asked what her father was doing. He threw the burning stone onto the ground, and everything around was illuminated by an orange flame. And Capella looked at the fire with delight. Sitting down next to him, the main character finally enjoyed the warmth emanating from the fire. Corvus, sitting nearby on a rock and looking at his daughter, asked her to have a good rest now. Looking at the fire, the man thought that even though one stone cost 50,000 lyre, his daughter was more important to him. He was glad that Capella was warm and with a smile on her face, but she, when she heard his thoughts about the cost of the stone, jumped up in horror from this. The girl suddenly decided to apologize to her father, taking out the necklace that he had given her during the day and showing what had happened to it now. Corvus asked her not to worry about it, and he himself remembered the cost of the artifact of 1,000,000 lyre, but he did not care about the price because it was disposable and the royal seal was used for it. While her father sat with a smile on his face, Capella almost fainted from hearing the prices of these jewels. But he didn't care about these things, because looking at his daughter now, he thought that he was ready to give everything for her, just so that she would be completely okay. Capella herself could not understand whether her father was really ready to do anything for her, because moments from the past flashed through her head. The girl, raising her head, suddenly looked at the man and decided to ask if her father loved her. But he turned away, saying that the heroine was asking some nonsense, and he mentally repeated that he simply adored his daughter and thought that it was clearly visible. Capella closed her eyes, smiling. She understood that if she had not heard her father, she would quickly have been offended by him. Now it warmed her heart. And then Corvus suddenly blurted out that perhaps Mom would love the main character much more than he does. These words made the girl freeze with her mouth open. The man shared that his beloved was so looking forward to the birth of her daughter, and he still remembers it. Capella recalled that in her past life, her father had never told her anything like that. Jumping up abruptly, the girl declared that she knew nothing at all about her mother, hinting that she wanted to know more. The man, smiling, replied that all this was because there were not even any portraits left of her, and then added that all this was funny, because at first he did not even want to have anything to do with her. Corvus shared that his beloved was a commoner, and they had different statuses. It was very difficult for them to get permission to marry. And then he added that Capella was still in her mother's belly before they got married. The girl considered this shameful, blushing. But suddenly, the man declared that he then killed his beloved. He killed all his relatives and the mother of his daughter, because he is the reaper of death. Before he could finish speaking, the father was suddenly attacked by a Capella bird, which began to peck at him. He became indignant, thinking that she was hungry. Turning around, the man was getting ready to leave, asking Ruri if she was eating nuts. He was also worried that his daughter was hungry. In an instant, Corvus suddenly rushed forward in anger, as if trying to catch someone, until Capella suddenly grabbed him, as if stopping him. The girl grabbed the edge of her father's coat. He looked at her in surprise. Looking at the man with wide eyes, the heroine suddenly asked if the Reaper of Death would kill her too. This question shocked him, but he quickly pulled himself together. Turning around, he answered that yes, if he had to do it in the future, although he himself had not made such a future at all. Capella could clearly see how her father was trembling. It frightened her, and suddenly, distracting the heroine, Ruri flew past. And then she fluttered up and rushed forward somewhere, away from the girl, who ran after her, asking her not to run outside. But when they got there together, Capella's mouth opened in delight as the northern lights appeared before her. Corvus's voice was heard behind him. He was telling how he and Eliza, the girl's mother, had once looked at this miracle of nature in the same way. Putting his hand on the girl's hat, he admitted that he was very glad to see this with her. Looking at the northern lights, the man thought about how much he wanted them to be here now. The three of them, his face was very upset. At such moments, it was hard for the heroine to think about revenge. But she will never be able to forget that rage and sadness. Although when Capella began to hear everything that was in her father's soul, she changed her mind a little. Suddenly turning to the men, the girl smiled sincerely at him, declaring that if he had to kill her, then let him do it without hesitation. Looking at Corvus's frightened and confused face, the heroine thought that she wanted this man to be afraid, to cry. She wanted to erase his cool expression. Capella didn't know why everything happened this way in their future, but now the girls wanted one thing: to become stronger. Looking into her father's eyes, the heroine continued to talk about how when the time comes to kill her, she will do it in such a way that even the Reaper of Death will doubt that this will be her revenge. After a while, Capella fell asleep, leaning on her father's shoulder, snoring quietly, and he thought that he would never have thought that his daughter would say something like that. Smiling, he poked the girl in the cheek, thinking that when she said something like that, the Reaper himself would become enchanted by her. Then, Ruri sat on the man's shoulder and began to chirp joyfully. Corvus scratched her neck, realizing that she wasn't afraid of him either. Looking at his daughter lying on his shoulder, he smiled again and quietly said that they would soon drive him crazy at this rate. The very next morning, the main character was in the city, in a warm bed, peacefully dozing. Opening her eyes, she noticed the unfamiliar surroundings around her. The bed was different, as were the walls. The girl's little bird immediately rushed to her, and Capella immediately asked her little friend if they were home now. And then she remembered how she and her father got lost and immediately jumped out of bed. After all, in the evening, she suddenly dozed off during the conversation, and now she was worried that something might be wrong with her father. So she ran to him, stopped, and behind the door, the girl heard a familiar voice. Entering the room, she saw her father sitting on a chair and immediately called out to him. He sighed, saying that she had finally woken up, although he was sincerely glad about it. Capella was interested in one thing. How was Corvus's leg, which she asked about? He blamed it on a dream, saying that she had dreamed it, and he himself was very surprised that she found out, because he had not spoken about it, thinking that the power of love was to blame for everything. The heroine was confused by this. She did not believe that she could hear his thoughts because of some kind of power of love. Then a male voice was heard behind them, and the girl slowly turned to look at its source. Seeing Duke Ophelia and her daughters standing before him, Corvus stated that they had arrived quite early. Capella first rushed to her friend, Juno, asking her for help for her father, who had injured his leg. She replied that she could very well help, and then suddenly noticed the contemptuous look of her adoptive father. She admitted that she came to the city because she learned about Capella's disappearance. Taking the heroine by the hands, she asked her friend not to worry, because thanks to her father, everything was fine with her. Juno went to Corvus, asking him to let her take a look at her sore leg. He replied that before that, he wanted to discuss something first. His gaze was stern and angry. He explained that his daughter was the only one who found herself at the foot of the cliff when the avalanche came down. The man was interested in one thing. Why? Charla visibly tensed up when she heard this, stuttering as she replied that she had nothing to do with it. Her father, taking his daughter by the shoulders, laughed, asking her not to scare the children so much, and then added that he had already received a report on the situation that had happened and, in his opinion, it was just an accident. When Capella heard about this, she immediately became indignant, exclaiming loudly, and when the man asked them not to worry about trifles, the girl slammed her hands on the table. And then, pointing her finger at Charla, she said that this girl had pushed her down, and she was horrified that her rival had dared to tell about it. Grinning, Capella began to talk about how, since Charla had deliberately pushed her down, would her father take responsibility for his daughter's actions? He grinned, calling the heroine an energetic young lady, brushing her hair off her shoulders. The girl remembered that, for the treatment from Juno, the Ophelia family received this town. Corvus was surprised that his daughter would suddenly talk about this, and then he noticed a sly grin on her face. Mr. Ophelia smiled tensely, while the girl suggested that since the reward for saving a life was territory, then the same would be given for threatening a life, after which she turned to her father, saying that she really liked this city. The Capella said that she wanted this city for herself, because there were many hospitable people who greeted them at the entrance. Hearing this, Corvus was surprised, thinking that the girl was doing this for the sake of the people who were having a hard time there, but she didn't care about the people living there. The main thing she wants is to take everything away from Charla, so that she pays for going to fight her. The heroine almost incinerated the girl with her gaze. Here her father laughed, calling Capella a very smart girl. She immediately turned to the man. He insisted that the heroine was saying reasonable things, but he was interested in who would testify against his Charla. Grinning, the man asked the girl if she had at least one living witness, that the heroine was pushed, and that it was not an accident. After this request, Capella suddenly became noticeably nervous, because she did not know who could become a witness. The girls remembered that the whole video was Charla's bodyguard, but he was her man, and was unlikely to speak out against her. The situation really irritated Capella. She didn't know at all what to do. But at that moment, Corvus put his hand on her shoulder, thinking about how well his daughter had handled everything. The man suggested that Mr. Ophelia listen to the testimony of each person, but the girl felt that her father clearly emanated an aura of madness. Here, Raquel, who was nearby, suddenly called out to Charla's guard, asking him for a minute, and then whispered something in the man's ear. He was very surprised after hearing this, but it was not clear what exactly the boy told him. But then the man suddenly stepped forward, declaring that he wished to act as a witness. Without thinking twice, the man shared that Charla really did push the main character off the cliff. Upon hearing this, the hostess was shocked, and her father smiled nervously. He continued speaking while everyone looked at him in surprise, not understanding why he decided to tell everything. The brute explained that when the avalanche happened, he was unable to reach Capella, and Raquel listened to all this with a satisfied smile. The man again emphasized that Charla had unmistakably decided to push the main character out of envy or anger, and she was becoming more and more enraged by the words of her guard, and she jumped up from her place. Rushing towards him, the girl screamed that he was her bodyguard and did not dare testify against her. Charla's gaze was wild, pointing her finger at the man. She declared that he was the same as his sister and that he would never see her again. Here the girl's father loudly called his daughter by name, standing behind her back. He was clearly furious with his daughter's behavior, and she was afraid of him. It was noticeable. The Duke was called out in time by Raquel, who finally suggested getting back to business. Pointing to the bodyguard, the boy said that he liked him and asked for the opportunity to buy him for himself. Ophelia replied that the boy was just a child. He smiled and confirmed this fact, and then, holding out the papers, stated that his father runs Gordsky's company. Baron Gordsky has enormous influence in finances. He received his title 5 years ago, an upstart who wants to connect with the Corvus family. The man thought that this was why his son was trying to make them indebted to him, anticipating such situations and giving his child money just in case. But it was the first time Capella had heard her father acknowledge anyone. Raquel, grinning, said that he might well invite his father for a serious deal if the amount on the check was not enough. But then Duke Ophelia unexpectedly bowed before Corvus, apologizing for his daughter's behavior. Holding the girl tightly by the shoulder, smiling nervously, he declared that he would never have thought that his daughter was so treacherous, adding that they would heal the man's leg for free, while Charla was shaking with fear. Corvus said he didn't care, thinking about how to make sure they never harmed his daughter again, and Capella exclaimed. The girl said that her father used very expensive artifacts to protect her. The heroine was interested in who would pay for this. Turning to the window, Capella stated that, according to her calculations, the total amount was 1,100,000 lyre, also adding that Corvus had to use all the artifacts without the necessary permission, and she has no other choice but to tell the prince about everything. The girl played to the crowd, saying that she was very interested in what Oberon would say about this. Having drawn herself and him on the window, the heroine declared that he was her favorite fiancé, and she was afraid to imagine what would happen when he found out about everything. Duke Ophelia gave in. His daughter's actions greatly surprised Corvus. He looked at her with wide eyes, while they were told that all rights to the past territories would be returned to them. Capella was proud of herself and very happy about such news, and the father, looking at his daughter, understood that this child was much scarier than himself. When it was all over, Raquel, Capella, and Corvus went outside. The boy said that he would wait for his father with Lord Ophelia. The man did not believe that he had managed to pull off all this, and said that even under such conditions he would not agree to adoption. But then the boy declared that, until today, he had done everything according to his father's orders, and according to his orders, he was going to become the eldest son of Corvus. Remembering the man's act when he rushed after his daughter and looked at him, Raquel admitted that now he sincerely wants to become part of their family. They looked at him in surprise, until Ruri suddenly jumped out of her mistress's arms and rushed towards the boy, flying around him. He looked at her, watching every flap of her wings. All three were surprised by such a gesture from the little bird, and perhaps it was some kind of sign or hint from her. After some time, Raquel saw Capella and her father off on their journey. When they got into the carriage, the girl waved to him with a smile, and he spoke about the jet of the next meeting. The next evening, when the deal was made, Raquel's father looked at his son and kept saying that it was a huge pile of money, and he wondered if the boy was sure that it was really a good deal. Turning to face the man, he, grinning suspiciously, asked his father not to worry, assuring him that he would not let him suffer losses. Apparently, the boy had a cunning plan in his head. Looking out the window, Capella exclaimed joyfully, because their house was finally visible there. While the girl was waving her arms out the window, Corvus sighed, asking his daughter to sit quietly for a bit, but then fell silent, looking at her contented face. The man recalled how much had happened during this trip, and his sweet daughter was able to show herself from a completely different side. Then a loud childish sneeze was heard throughout the carriage, and when Capella turned around, Corvus saw how her eyes turned red and snot began to flow from her nose. When they arrived home, they immediately wrapped the girl in a blanket, put a wet cloth on her head, and began to treat her. Because she had managed to catch a cold, the father could not understand why the girl did not tell him anything earlier. Mentally, he was very worried about his daughter, while she was coughing hoarsely and burning with fever. Then the maid turned to the man and asked him to give her the rest. Hearing this, Corvus became very angry and began to literally tremble with rage. Because he himself wanted to be with his daughter and try to help her recover, he was irritated by this woman, and he even began to think about firing her. Capella realized that she had no choice, and, tugging her father by the sleeve, stood up, saying that she wanted to eat the porridge that he would prepare for her. These words struck the man. Turning around, he agreed, saying that a father should take care of his child, and then headed towards the exit. Iris, looking after the owner, asked the girl if her father had ever cooked himself in his life, and she, in a half-dead state, answered that she had no idea. This amused the woman, and while putting Capella to bed, she offered to cook everything herself and then replace her father's dishes with hers. He was already in the kitchen, dispersing everyone there. The servants were perplexed by such suddenness of their master, and the maid assumed that Capella had thrown him out so as not to infect him, and thus took care of him. She, hearing about this, was horrified. Quickly climbing under the blanket and covering herself with a pillow, the girl declared that she apparently had a fever and was now going to sleep, although this was not the case, and she was simply going to avoid the conversation. The heroine herself was shaking with embarrassment, covering herself with her pillow, and her bird kept circling around, chirping. Capella thought that because of her father, she had no time to relax. When the girl finally fell asleep, after a while, there was a knock on her door, informing her that guests had arrived. She slowly opened her eyes, in a sleepy state, and then got up, stretching sweetly. There was no temperature. Having risen, she could not understand where her Ruri had suddenly flown off to. The heroine looked around, never finding her pet. Then, unexpectedly, the door to the room swung open, and the young Prince Oberon burst in with a cry, anxiously calling his bride by name. Yuno was with him. She stood with the maid in the doorway, who told the prince that he couldn't burst in like that. The main character was surprised that her friends had come to her so unexpectedly, but the boy was walking quickly towards her, explaining that he had heard that his fiancé had a fever. Oberon approached Capella, bombarding her with questions about her health. It was clear that he was really worried about the girl. She was embarrassed and blushing, trying to keep her distance between them. Iris and Yuno felt rather awkward. The main character asked not to come so close to her because she had not had time to take a bath, but the prince was indignant because the girl was sick and she could not bathe. Here Oberon called out to Yuno, reminding him that Capella was a girl and that she, like anyone else, wanted to look beautiful in front of her loved one, after which the girl winked at him. The prince, hearing this, began to twirl his hair around his finger, embarrassed, and the heroine mentally thanked her friend for saving her, although she wanted to formulate the thought differently. Here Yuno's hand reached for Capella's hair, straightening it, and she at the same time touched the girl's head, which surprised the heroine. The saint, smiling, shared that the heroine's temperature had dropped, and apparently she was not needed there in the first place. But then Capella grabbed her friend by the hands, looked into her eyes, and said that this was not at all the case, because the heroine was very happy that Yuno had come to her. The girl, after looking at her for a couple of seconds, suddenly tensed up, as if indifferently answering her that everything was fine. And then, again forcing a smile, she explained that it was better for her to leave anyway, explaining that she did not want to interfere with the reunion of two lovers who had not seen each other for a long time. As Yuno left, she asked Capella to take care of herself while she looked after her with concern. At this time, in the kitchen, Ruri was still circling around Corvus, who was cooking in the kitchen, creating something strange. The dish looked and smelled so-so. The servants and the repetitive staff standing nearby were also not delighted and were preparing, if necessary, to save the owner and his kitchen, but they themselves were suffocating from the smell, while the entire kitchen was turned upside down and there was dirt everywhere. Corvus was angry because he couldn't do anything, remembering his wife. He understood that if she were here, everything would be different. The man tightly squeezed the ladle in his hand in anger, and in a matter of seconds, he was already flying in the opposite direction, rattling. He understood that he had to cope and cook porridge for his daughter. Here, Corvus's attention was drawn to Ruri, a bird that was carrying him a basket of groceries, and looking at her, he suddenly calmed down, realizing that he had to start all over again. Following the advice of his feathered friend, the man pulled out what he needed from the basket, while the bird chirped joyfully, looking at him. Then, at the entrance, a girl's voice was heard calling out to the Duke. It was Yuno. She was standing, looking at the man with a weak smile. Corvus, noticing the saint of the Ophelia family, asked if she had come to visit his daughter. She confirmed this fact, and then took something out of her sleeve. Handing the Duke a strange envelope, Yuno declared that there was something very important inside. The man himself looked at the saint in surprise, not understanding what could possibly be there. Meanwhile, in Capella's room, the prince stood opposite her. She, looking away in embarrassment, invited the boy to sit down, and he agreed. And, without asking where, he sat down right on the heroine's bed, which surprised her greatly, because she was hinting at a chair. It was clear to her that Oberon was still just a child. The boy turned to the heroine and asked where she was going to go in 3 years. After this question, Capella froze, because she had completely forgotten about it. Oberon, jumping up from his seat, said that he had heard that the main character was very smart, so for her sake he would study harder, after which he suggested that they enroll together in the Hercules school. Capella remembered that in her past life, she was sent to an online academy for girls, and her father insisted on this very much, not listening to protests, and in general, not taking into account his daughter's opinion. And after Capella started living in the boarding school, her relationship with her father became much worse, so now she felt uneasy. Oberon explained that the Hercules Academy was located near her home, and also added, beaming, that they would be able to be together much more often. Hugging a pillow, the heroine assumed that her father would not give permission for this and would decide to send her to a boarding school, which surprised the prince. He said he thought Duke Corvus would let his daughter go wherever she wanted, adding that his mother had told him it would be difficult for the girl otherwise. Taking his bride by the hand and smiling, Oberon declared that he would help convince Father Capella and do whatever was required. The heroine, without moving, turned completely red, because the prince's face was so close to her and he still continued to hold her hands. Capella decided to close her eyes so as not to look at him, blushing even more. Noticing this, the prince also became embarrassed and immediately removed his hands, apologizing. The next day, the main character was already full of energy and literally fluttered, sincerely happy about something. Capella ran down the hallway, thinking that first of all she needed to thank Yuno for visiting her, and then she suddenly remembered what the prince had said about Hercules Academy. It was an elite academy attended not only by people of royal families, but also by those with different talents. It created heroes. There were many advantages. Besides, this way she and Oberon would be side by side. But the girl already knew what her father would tell her, because she was pretty bad at her studies. But there were still 3 whole years ahead, and there was a chance to make up for lost time. If she changed her place of study, something could change. When Capella entered her father's office, he looked at her and said that it was already quite late, although in fact, he simply wanted his daughter to rest more. Although she was very worried, the girl finally made up her mind and declared that she wanted to study at the Hercules Academy. When the man heard about this, his hands began to tremble. Putting the cup of tea back on the table, Corvus didn't know what to answer to this. His daughter called out to him, but he didn't answer. Thinking that if she was happy, it would make him live forever, he was afraid of one thing, that his girls would be in danger again. Looking at her father with suspicion, Capella realized that he had again gone into weakling mode because he was ready to declare war. And now he was afraid to send his own daughter to the academy. Looking into her father's eyes with a smile, the girl reminded him of how she had said that she wanted to become stronger, promising to study harder and be of greater use to him in the future. Adjusting his glasses, Corvus, resigned, suggested in that case to hire a tutor for his daughter. Capella felt like a winner and was very happy. He added that he really hoped that his daughter would be able to get along with the tutor. In the near future, he decided to introduce his daughter to her, a tutor named Mariabel, a young girl with ample breasts and long pink hair. She greeted the girl, saying that she was glad to meet him, but the heroine was surprised by such a teacher who smelled of perfume a mile away. Corvus introduced the girl as a graduate of the Hercules Academy, and Yuno was nearby, who brought her to them. Mariabel shared that after graduation, she became the wife of the now-deceased Margrave Rakar. The girl was supposed to manage his territory, but she could not cope with such an amount of work. The tutor decided to start right away, suggesting that they first study situations in the world, but Yuno, turning around, declared that she would go because she did not want to interfere with her friend's educational process. Capella rushed towards her, took her by the hand and stopped her. The girl asked if her friend really didn't want to study together. She explained that she was only here to introduce the heroine to Mariabel, and then asked her friend to try her best and enter the academy. She continued to hold Yuno's hand and asked where she was going to go to school in 3 years. Although Capella herself knew that in a past life they entered the same online academy together, now the heroine is going to enter a completely different school. Forcing a smile, the saint admitted that her father was preparing the most suitable career path for her. But then Capella threw herself into her friend's arms. She didn't want to leave her alone. She just stood there, not understanding what was happening. The heroine suggested that Yuno study with her, and then turned to her father, asking permission. He looked away, replying that she should do as she wanted. After these words, the teacher suddenly giggled, blushing, and then she went up to the girls and hugged them with a smile, saying that she would also be glad to have 2 students instead of 1, and that it would also be good for the girls. Mariabel, looking at Yuno, said that she would tell the Duke of Ophelia about this, asking if the girl agreed with this. She looked extremely scared after this, and then took her friend by the hand. She wondered if Capella was sure about her proposal, but she just smiled in response and insisted that she was absolutely sure about everything. While the girls chatted, Corvus watched Mariabel with a strange look, as if trying to see something or someone in her. The woman, smiling and clapping her hands, invited the girls to learn more about the border territory of Rakir. Opening the map, she began to explain to her students all the necessary information, which was not difficult to remember. Capella, seeing a familiar city on the map, pointed to it with her finger, stating that she had been there. It was Albatrain. Mariabel mentioned that it had recently been returned to her family. The heroine looked at the map with a smile, thinking that her father was, after all, a good ruler. Yuno looked slightly tense and displeased as she watched her friend. Mariabel clapped her hands, declaring that they had become a bit distracted, and continued her story, mentioning the poor crops and lack of minerals. The girl mentioned the wonderful embroidery and well-developed lace knitting. The tutor said that's why she asked her husband to support their craft, and that's all she did. Mariabel boasted that many people still say that she has many achievements, which makes her feel awkward. Capella was surprised, because the lace is small, and it is not profitable to sell it at a high price. In her opinion, Yuno replied that she had heard that lace dresses cost a fortune. Moreover, Rakar lace has a reputation for good quality, and the saint mentioned that her family also likes such clothing. Mariabel drew attention to the main character's dress, saying that her clothes also had lace, and she immediately began to examine it in surprise. Yuno smiled, saying that Capella always wears beautiful clothes, because she is the Duke's favorite daughter. All this greatly surprised the heroine, and how such trifles greatly changed women's fashion. Mariabel looked at her in confusion, and then suggested discussing lace next time. That evening, sitting at the same table with her father, Capella shared with him her impressions of the teacher, saying how much she liked her and that she was able to see the potential in the craft. Corvus seemed to exhale, thinking that the two of them got along. The girls did not understand these thoughts at all, and then he asked if his daughter liked Maribel. She answered that yes, because the girl really is a good teacher. And after this, the main character was faced with an extremely unexpected question about how she would react if Maribel suddenly became her mother. This question left the girl completely stumped. The man looked at her, waiting for an answer, watching her reaction. After just a couple of seconds, Capella jumped up from her seat, hitting the table with her palm with all her might. She looked her father in the eye, asking what he meant by this. Corvus calmly explained to his daughter that this woman was offered to him as a candidate for marriage, and if his daughter liked her, then he could agree. But after that, Capella took her words back and literally screamed that she didn't like Maribel at all. The father was completely calm and did not panic, reminding that his daughter had just said the exact opposite of her words. But the girl continued to scream, explaining that he didn't like her. Hearing this, the man looked at his daughter in surprise. It seemed to him that Capella suddenly took on an adult tone. She became nervous, realizing that she had almost given herself away, then asked if this woman would become her mother, then his wife. The girl explained that the child should not be trusted with such an important decision. He replied that Capella would clearly be happier with his mother, and he himself understood that if he had not taken her with him then, the girl would not have had to go through all this. Hearing these thoughts, the heroine was horrified. Looking at her father, she was in shock. And then he said that at least this way she would have someone to talk to, while Capella almost screamed in a rage that she had grace for that. Corvus noted that she was certainly talented, but being a mother was a completely different matter. These words angered the girl even more, causing her to squeeze the glass in her hand with all her might. And then, having completely spilled it out on her father, she turned around and walked away, telling him that he could do whatever he wanted. The man, with a glass on his head, sat in shock and did not understand what had just happened and whether his daughter was really so angry with him. Capella, walking down the corridor, was really very angry and literally cursed Corvus, not understanding how this happened, because this did not happen in the past. It was unclear to her why he suddenly forgot about his beloved wife and the girl's mother, assuming that her father no longer loved her. Entering her room, Capella slammed the door loudly and fell onto her bed, burying her face in her pillow, telling herself what a fool her father was. Tears were running down her cheeks, and she understood that she would not be happy if he chose a mother only for her. After these thoughts, the girl burst into tears. Meanwhile, Corvus, in his room, was looking thoughtfully out the window, as if trying to digest everything that had happened today. Corvus, sitting in his room at the table, involuntarily recalled his quarrel with his daughter. He was pleased that she was worried about him, but the man was afraid that something might happen to him, and Corella would be left alone after that, when his attention was drawn to familiar sounds. Turning around, he saw Ruri nearby, holding a branch with a berry in her beak, looking at him. Corvus was surprised, because the bird brought him the berry that a person could eat. He considered it a gift, but when the man tried it, he wrinkled his face from the acid. Taking off his glasses, the Duke gently stroked the bird, declaring that it had opened his eyes and that now he understood everything, after which he suddenly realized that, it turned out, this was his first quarrel with Capella, as father and child. The next day, the main character and her father sat at breakfast opposite each other in complete silence. He smiled and thought that his daughter was still offended, and she was infuriated that he was smiling for no reason. Having finished eating, the girl stood up abruptly, thanked her for the food, and said that she would go and prepare for her upcoming lesson with the teacher. Corvus took a sip of tea and quietly hummed, not reacting in any other way, which only further irritated Capella, while her father reflected on how he never thought that the day would come when they would quarrel. The heroine, freaking out, walked away. And then it was time for class. Yuno and the teacher had already arrived. The girls were sitting opposite her. Capella was still angry and afraid that in this way Maribel would find out her true aura. Then a brilliant idea came to the girl's mind. She raised her hand and decided to ask what the teacher thought about her father. And she, hearing this question, was very surprised. And then, smiling and blushing, she replied that she considered Corvus a fine gentleman, adding that it was the first time she had met such a good man. Then a familiar voice was heard behind the girls. It was the Duke. He asked Mariabel for forgiveness and said that he just wanted to watch. Capella was assessing the father, who was walking towards them. Because he had long legs, was tall, had a slender build and a flawless face, and he was also only 28 years old. Noticing how his daughter was looking at him, he asked if he had anything on his face, and she turned away and replied that she did not. Turning to Mariabel, Corvus said that if he was in the way, he could leave. She replied that everything was fine, and his presence did not bother them. At this time, Capella was watching them. She understood that she could be without her mother, but her father, hardly. While they were chatting, the girls understood that he needed a new wife. But then, Yuno gently pulled the heroine by the edge of her collar. The girl whispered to her friend that her father and teacher looked good together. Capella, looking at them sadly, answered only one thing. It was probably obvious that she was worried. A few hours later, the main character was sitting over her homework and still couldn't get it together, which Yuno noticed as she leaned over her. She wondered if Capella was sure she didn't want her father to remarry, and Capella pouted and replied that that wasn't quite true. She understood that he would clearly feel better if he found himself a new wife, and her future would be brighter. Yuno saw how worried her friend was and almost trembled. Here the girls saw their teacher's pen lying on the floor. Capella, picking it up, assumed that she had not yet left, and the saint assumed that she was reporting to her father about the lesson. The main character, grabbing Yuno by the hand, said that they would go to her father's office, but she, holding on to her friend, looked away as if she knew something. When they arrived, they stood in front of the door, as if waiting for something or trying to listen to the sounds. The heroine was about to knock, but Yuno stopped her. Strange voices were heard inside, which she reported. The girls carefully opened the doors, looking out of the corner of their eyes into the dark room. There they saw the following. Corvus was sitting on the sofa, and Mariabel was leaning over him, putting her hand on his face and asking the man not to be so stubborn. After seeing this, the main character rushed to her room, hiding her face in the pillow, and kept screaming that she never wanted to see something like that. But, on the other hand, she understood that if Mariabel really did become his wife, then they would definitely go much further. Capella's head immediately began to draw terrible pictures, which made her jump out of bed and start screaming in horror, and then fell back onto the bed, hugging her pillow. Then the girl heard familiar sounds from the side. It was Ruri. The heroine apologized to her for making so much noise and waking up the bird. She looked quite sad. Looking at her little friend, the main character said that if she were a human, it would be very cool. The bird turned around in surprise, looking at her. Capella recalled that they had known each other since birth, and she believed that she and Ruri were firmly connected by fate itself. The heroine immediately began to dream, thinking that if the bird were a person, it could well be her friend, younger or older sister. Holding it in her arms and smiling, the girl reminded that they both had no mother, and they could discuss their worries with each other. Capella was sure that every day would only become more fun for her. Putting the bird on the pillow, the heroine suggested that they sleep together today. Looking at Ruri, the girl declared that she loved her, so she really hoped and asked for her to stay with her forever. In her past life, Ruri was not there, and even if Capella could not change the future, at least she would ease her burden. The bird was very dear to her. The girl fell asleep, and a tear ran down her cheek, and she herself called her little friend by name and repeated that she loved her. The next day, Corvus stood near the exit. Capella and Mariabel accompanied him. He explained that today he would need to leave for the castle. The girl replied that the man could leave the children with her. He leaned over to his daughter and asked the girl not to create problems, while he himself thought about how he would miss her, wondering why she couldn't fit into his pocket and he couldn't take it away. The girl thought he was very strange. After some time, the girls were already sitting in another lesson, listening to what Mariabel was telling them about the past king, who had died 15 years ago. Capella was not listening at all, thinking about the love of adults, because she thought that at that moment in the room, the teacher and father were doing something and should have become closer. The girl noticed that the heroine was distracted and asked if she was listening to her. She, without thinking, answered that she didn't know, which surprised both Mariabel and Yuno. Realizing what she said, the heroine immediately apologized. The teacher closed the book and sighed, saying that Capella couldn't concentrate at all today. So she said that she had a request for the main character. The girls immediately looked at her in surprise, waiting for what she would say now. Sometime later, the three of them stood at the entrance to the treasury. Apparently, Mariabel asked the heroine to show her this room, and memories of the explosion flashed through the girl's head. Opening the door, she led the guests inside. They gasped in delight, and Capella recalled that her father had strictly forbidden her to enter this room. Mariabel looked around and hugged the girls, saying that all these treasures were quite impressive, and then they separated, leaving the teacher to look at the artifacts. Yuno suddenly approached the door. Noticing this, Capella asked if there was something wrong with the door. She, getting nervous, answered that no, and she would be able to open it. The main character did not understand what her friend was getting at. Then Mariabel called out to the girl, calling her to her. The saint made sure that the heroine left, and then returned to her strange affairs. The teacher showed Capella a plate, which the girl wanted to take. The woman spoke about how beautiful the dishes were, holding out her hand to them, but then the heroine exclaimed sharply, saying that it was better not to touch them. She shared that the last time she wanted to touch it, her father scolded her, and he had a rather frightening look, which still brings tears to the girl's eyes. While Capella was telling this, Mariabel carefully extended her hand to the pearl, trying not to attract attention. But Yuno noticed it, and apparently Ruri, because he jumped off the shoulder of his mistress. The bird rushed straight at the teacher. She was very surprised, but did not expect at all that it would peck her right in the hand. The girl pulled her hand away, dropped the treasure. Enraged, she threw the bird away with her hand, screaming that something was clearly wrong with it, and it fell to the floor. Capella immediately picked her up, looking angrily at Mariabel. She did not understand why the girl did this to her little friend. She screamed that Ruri was the first to rush at her and asked the main character to get rid of this barbaric bird. The girl did not like such statements addressed to her friend, and she began to be indignant. Capella explained in a raised voice that her bird would not attack someone without a reason. Mariabel showed her hand, asking why Ruri had suddenly pecked her hand. Yuno noticed out of the corner of her eye the pearl lying on the floor that the teacher wanted to steal. She picked it up and hid it on the shelves. The main character suddenly turned to her friend, pointing her finger at the woman and asking if the saint had seen Mariabel try to steal anything. She, for some strange reason, lied, saying that she had not seen anything like that. Hearing this, the woman smugly brushed her hair off her shoulders, as if thinking that she had won. Capella looked at her with a displeased look, pressing the bird to herself, while the teacher insisted that she would personally report to Corvus about what Ruri had done. And then Mariabel laughed, looking down at the girl and saying that she would be glad to see the man's reaction to this situation. The next day, Corvus, sitting opposite the girl, spoke of how sorry he was, and then placed the promised envelope of money in front of her, after which he informed her that the Axion family no longer wanted to deal with her. Mariabel's eyes widened, and she exclaimed in surprise, not wanting to believe what she heard. The girl became nervous, asking him to wait and trying to explain that she had simply brushed off the bird, which had wounded her in the arm for no reason. But Corvus stood his ground and explained that Ruri was like a mother to Capella. He understood that this bird had always looked after his daughter, and she was very important to her, and therefore to him too. When her father said that Ruri was, so to speak, his beloved, the girl was very surprised. And then the man suddenly hugged the heroine to himself, smiling and protecting his feathered friend, saying that since she did this, it meant she was protecting his family. These words touched Capella to the depths of her soul. But Mariabel considered this wild nonsense, which she said quite directly. It was strange to her that some bird was considered a mother, and the main character suddenly asked her to stop. Pointing her finger at the girl, Capella reminded her that she had already been fired from her post as a teacher, so the girl asked the woman to leave the house as quickly as possible. Looking at her terribly, the heroine asked if she wanted the daughter of the Reaper of Death to hate her even more. This scared the girl terribly, and she ran away, her heels flashing. The father called out to his daughter, asking if she was sure of her decision, Since this woman could become her mother, she turned to him, asking what he was talking about, since the man had just said that Ruri was like a mother to her. And then she even reminded me that she has Yuno, Grace, and even Prince Oberon. And Capella, of course, did not forget to mention her father, the Reaper of Death. This greatly surprised the man. He looked at her with his eyes wide open, while the girl said that they were all her family, and that was enough for her, although this company was a little strange. And then, realizing what she said, she began to apologize to Yuno, asking her not to think that her friend thought she was somehow different. Corvus also turned to the girl, asking her to tell Lord Ophelia that the marriage was annulled. She nodded, and Capella was very surprised to learn that her friend knew about everything. The saint explained that her father believed that she could help them improve their relationship, and after that, the girl left them, going home. So the father and daughter were left alone, sitting silently next to each other. The situation was a little awkward. Corvus suddenly spoke up, asking if parental relationships could influence children, while he was thinking about his daughter's adolescence and how much he still loved her. All these thoughts were wildly confusing to the girl, and now she didn't even want to hear all of this. Jumping up from her seat, Capella blurted out that she hadn't quarreled with him. He was surprised, asking if that was really true. Looking at the floor, she still thought about the fact that he should find a wife, and then she realized that she couldn't stand it. At this time, Mariabelle's photograph was burning, while someone's hand carefully held it by the edge, and ashes flew around. The burner turned out to be Yuno. Looking at the burning photograph, the girl said that this woman turned out to be extremely useless, and it would not be possible to use her anymore. Then a male voice was heard behind her. It was the girl's adoptive father, who upon entering the room, dropped her on the floor, placing his foot on her back, thereby showing his superiority over her, and asking if she had recently been to the Axion family. Yuno, lying on the floor, shared that it seemed like Capella was going to enroll in Hercules Academy, and he thought about it, realizing that Charla was also going to enroll there. And then he pressed even harder on the saint's fragile back, telling her not to bother him anymore, because he had already sent his own daughter to the academy, and she didn't even dare dream about it. The Lord kept saying that Charla must become Prince Oberon's wife, while she stood behind the door, eavesdropping on her father's words. Upon hearing this, she turned around and ran away. The girl ran as fast as she could, crying and cursing her father, because she didn't want to marry the prince. She liked Raquel, and she wanted him to be her husband. Remembering the situation when he protected Capella, and not her, Charla understood that the girl took him away from her. She was not going to forgive her for this, because she thinks that only she should get the best. Now she thought only about revenge on Capella, was angry at everything around her, and cried, holding a mirror in her hands. For Charla, it was love at first sight. When Raquel introduced himself to the girl, looking at her and smiling at her with all his heart, he bowed to her like a true gentleman. Seeing him, the girl's soul seemed to sing, and their fathers hoped for favorable cooperation between the families. When they said goodbye, Charla immediately rushed to her father, smiling and informing him that she wanted to marry Raquel. He, putting a creepy smile on his face, declared that his daughter would marry only Prince Oberon, and the girl had no choice but to obey. Charla is the daughter of a duke, and a political marriage is a means of protecting the family. She understood that all this would be done only for the sake of the family. But there was also an understanding that this also affected the Capella in some way. Officially, the main character is Prince Oberon's fiancé, and no matter how much Charlie wanted it, she was not going to take him away from her. But however, Capella, in her opinion, seemed to want to take Raquel away from her. She considered this very unfair. Charla thinks that her father can give the main character whatever her heart desires, as long as she doesn't touch her beloved. But, however, the father will never be able to give his daughter the one she loves so much. After all, for him, she is nothing more than a convenient tool. Charla believes that if Capella is gone, then perhaps she will be able to get everything she dreamed of. The girl will be able to marry the prince, continue to love Raquel and become a family with him, and also live well with her mom and dad. She thought that everyone deserves their own happiness, so she thought that this would affect her too. When Charla bought the servant, it was decided that she would also take another girl, Rachel. As compensation, the girl was able to receive a necklace. It was clear that the gift was cheap, but she thought that Raquel had specially prepared this decoration for her, and embarrassed, the girl asked him if he would help her put it on. The boy, smiling, agreed, and asked Charlotte to turn around so that he could fasten the jewelry on her neck. She understood that their families were very different in status, but she thought that there was still a chance for love between them. Raquel, noticing the maid running towards the guard, who had just been bought off, turned around to look at this sweet picture. They were happy to see each other, and with tears in their eyes, they rushed to hug each other. At this time, Charlotte did not pay attention to anything except the necklace that was given to her by the one she was so deeply in love with, after which the boy said goodbye to his friend. And after some time, she was waving goodbye to his carriage, impatiently awaiting their next meeting. And then Charlotte turned to the servants, declaring that now she needed to write a letter. She said this with a sly expression on her face. One day, Capella was sitting at the table, and her father brought her a whole bunch of books, causing her to open her mouth in shock. Looking sternly at his daughter, he asked what that exclamation had just been, and he himself was thinking that he could arrange a day off if she was tired, and in general, all this studying was not so necessary for his daughter. But then the girl replied that everything was fine, and she was ready to study. Ultimately, Capella's father began to tutor her, pulling her along in various directions, and the classes were strict, in which it was impossible to relax even a little. That day, when the girl was finally ready to start her next lesson, there was suddenly a knock on the door, and both turned around at the knock. Grace appeared in the room, apologizing for the interrupted lesson. She stated that Capella had received a letter. The woman was allowed to come in and deliver it. Taking the envelope in her hands and opening it, the girls, reading the contents, were horrified by what was written in it. It was an invitation to a party in honor of Charla's birthday. Looking at her father with a pitiful look, Capella asked if she had to go there. The man recalled that Prince Oberon himself had said that he would wait for them to meet at the party in honor of Charla's birthday, hinting that it was worth going. The heroine was haunted by a very strange feeling, because in her past life, she had not received any invitation from her, which meant that trouble was now clearly unavoidable. On the day of the party, a little girl was whipping someone, laughing maliciously. Apparently, she got obvious pleasure from someone else's pain. Tired, Charla stopped, trying to catch her breath, holding the whip in her hand, and then looked up at her victim with satisfaction, smiling. Her foster sister lay on the floor in front of her, tied with ropes, her face covered in bruises and blood. The girl thanked her for her patience as she looked at her in horror. Then the butler's voice was heard on the stairs, calling Charla, explaining that her guests were already waiting for her. Turning to her sister, she explained that she would be busy today, and then thanked Yuno for such a nice greeting, waving her hand at the end and smiling creepily. On the appointed day, Capella and Corvus showed up at Charla's birthday party. Capella was very hopeful that the day would go without any problems. They were met by a butler who informed them that the lady was now in the Duke's house, while the man was thinking about how much he wanted to go home. And here, the main character mentally agreed with her father for the first time. She looked at her as if trying to think of something. He noticed how his daughter was looking at him strangely, and Capella suddenly looked at him with her eyes, and in a sweet voice asked Corvus to spend the whole day with her. It was a blow to the heart. The heroine was too sweet, and he could barely cope with himself. But then a familiar voice was heard from afar, calling out to Capella. It was Prince Oberon. He was waving to his bride, talking about how long they had not seen her. The girls, looking at him, were embarrassed, not understanding why she suddenly missed him. He suddenly grabbed her hand. Oberon pulled Capella along with him, asking her to come with him to the others. When the Duke called out to the boy, Corvus coughed and looked at the prince, asking him to look after his daughter. And then they went their separate ways. The heroine realized that her plan had failed miserably. She began to worry about it. Noticing Capella's condition, Oberon asked his bride not to worry, because in his words, no matter what happened, he would stand up for her in any situation. The heroine was embarrassed, and at the same time angry that the prince was so handsome. She tried to restrain herself and not fall for him. Holding Oberon's hand, she still could not believe that such a kind prince would one day take and so heartlessly abandon her. Turning to her, the boy started talking about Capella's training, because he heard that the girls were studying hard, so he decided to offer to study together. But she suddenly interrupted him, saying that she was studying with her father. Then a familiar voice was heard. Raquel called out to the heroine, smiling at the girl. He reminded her that they had not seen each other for 3 whole months. She turned towards him, saying that they hadn't seen each other for quite a long time. He, smiling, asked if she missed him. Capella replied that there was no other way, and then, letting go of the prince's hand, she came closer. While they were discussing the servants that Raquel had bought, Oberon looked in shock at the hand his bride had released, and the heroine's new friend pointed his finger at the crowd, because there were those people there whom he had bought that day in Charlie. People gathered around, looking at someone in surprise. In the center stood the same guard and a small, bright girl. Capella was struck by her beauty and did not understand who she was, but Raquel called them closer to him. The girl and the man approached them. She immediately bowed to the main character, thanking her for helping her brother. She, hearing this, could not digest the words that this was the brother of this fragile and bright girl. Capella asked in surprise if this was true, and they looked at her silently. And then the blonde giggled sweetly, and her brother leaned towards her, while the heroine was indignant at how much they were not alike. Then the stranger suddenly removed the bandage from the thug's eyes, pointing to his eyes. They were exactly the same as hers. The girl asked if they were similar now. Capella, in surprise, stepped back and suddenly began to fall. But then Raquel caught her, holding her hand and looking the girl straight in the eyes. The heroine, embarrassed, apologized to her friend, and he asked her to be more careful. Oberon, watching all this, was beside himself with anger, because the main character is his bride. Pulling himself together, he smiled and asked her to introduce him to the stranger. Capella turned and pointed at Raquel, introducing him to the prince, who, smiling, declared that he would soon become the heroine's brother. Oberon tensed up, replying that he had only recently heard that it had not yet been fully decided, but the boy had stated that he definitely wanted to be the girl's brother. Placing his hands on the heroine's shoulder, Raquel grinned, asking the prince if he would be a son-in-law. This question really upset the prince, and he could barely contain his emotions, considering his interlocutor an impudent boy. But then a girlish, ringing voice was heard nearby. It was Charla who greeted Raquel, waving her hand at him. Capella, seeing her, was horrified, and the girl, running up to them, grabbed the boy's hand, saying that his favorite had arrived. And the main character continued to watch her with horror, while Charla looked back at her with a grin, as if trying to make her jealous. At this time, Charla's father thanked the guests for their presence, while Corvus, listening to these speeches, yawned. He was clearly not interested. The man's condition was noticed by Iris, the prince's mother, who said that he looked quite tired. Corvus, taking a sip of his drink, explained that he was just helping his daughter with her studies. The woman laughed, saying that he was, as always, too caring, adding that she had recently managed to hear a story in the castle. Glancing at him out of the corner of her eye, with a grin, Iris suddenly shared that people were talking about Charla being the one to marry Oberon. She asked him to explain these conversations. The man, hearing this, was very surprised. He even seemed to glow with joy, saying that it was strange. She heard notes of joy in his voice. Corvus advised her to talk about it with his daughter. Iris, looking at the man, shared her thoughts, because it seemed to her that her interlocutor was not telling her something. Corvus grinned and looked at the queen, assuming that her dear prince had suddenly been abandoned. She, upon hearing about this, was even upset, saying that she really liked Capella. After these words, the Duke looked at her, asking why Her Highness liked his daughter. But then the voice of the head of the Ophelia family was heard, inviting the guests to enjoy their modest banquet, while the children had fun in the garden. The queen, coming a little closer to Corvus, whispered to him, barely audibly, that she liked beautiful people. He was surprised by what he heard. At this time, Raquel suddenly pushed Charla away rudely, while smiling and talking about how glad he was to see her. She was very shocked by this, and then looked at the heroine with a hateful look. But suddenly, seeing her former servants nearby, Charla exclaimed, and the fair-haired girl immediately became noticeably frightened when she headed straight towards them. Pulling the girl by the dress, Ophelia smirked, asking who allowed her to dress in such beautiful clothes. And then she said that if she took off this dress and knelt down, she would forgive her for this insolence. But then the girl's older brother covered her with his body, protecting her. But then Raquel came to the rescue, blocking Charla's eyes and explaining that he himself had given her this dress for her hard work and had done it with his own money. Ophelia only opened her mouth in surprise, and the boy continued, telling her that this girl always does her job well, makes great tea, and therefore fully deserves good clothes. And then, taking Charla by the necklace that he himself had given her, looking into her eyes, he declared that this girl was much more valuable than some trinket. Turning around, he headed towards the servants, and then, turning his head towards Charla, asked them not to treat them with such contempt anymore, because he would not tolerate such things anymore. After this, everyone left Mrs. Ophelia, moving away from her to the side, and she stood in place, in complete shock. Capella sat down in front of the blonde, examining the lace on her dress. She was surprised, because it was the same Racalla lace. The prince was surprised by her knowledge. She replied that she read about them in a book. And when the main character said that she also wanted such a dress, asking the girl where she could buy it, she became embarrassed and panicked. Then Raquel explained that this was a new design that he had developed himself, and that this dress was an exclusive model, after which he winked at his new friend, suggesting that the dress on such a beauty would attract many clients, and the girl blushed at these words. But Capella, accidentally paying attention to Charla, saw with what hatred she, for some reason, was looking at her. It was not clear to her what she had done again. Lady Ophelia lost her temper and turned around and walked away, the heroine realizing that she herself was to blame for how she had behaved. But then Capella suddenly remembered that she wanted to meet her friend, Yuno, but completely forgot about it. At this time, Charla was heading down the stairs, apparently to take out all her anger on her adopted sister. She was angry, because on this day she had to be the center of attention. Going down, the girl saw Yuno kneeling. She looked extremely weak and exhausted. Charla, standing over her and holding a whip in her hands, suggested that her little sister play a little, looking at the poor girl with anger and hostility. Swinging, the girl began to whip her adopted sister with all the anger that was in her. She was outraged that today all the attention was not focused on her. Stopping, she ordered Yuno to start singing a congratulatory song to her. But when she obeyed and began to sing, Charla dealt the girl another blow to the face, which made her grit her teeth, and then, taking her sister by the chin, looked into her eyes with madness. She did not understand why Capella was better than her. She didn't understand why this girl got everything she wanted. It really irritated her. Pushing Yuno away from herself, Charla declared that she would take everything that could be taken from the main character. Laughing in her sister's face, she declared that she would tear her friend to pieces, asking if she was happy about it, and then turned around and went back to the celebration. Yuno carefully raised her head, putting on a smile and repeating those words about her friend. Apparently, this somehow surprised her greatly. At this time, Prince Oberon kept trying to send Raquel away so that he could be alone with his bride. But he refused and did not want to leave his friend at all. Capella understood perfectly well that they did not like each other, and this infuriated her, because they seemed to be competing with each other. While they were arguing, the girl turned around and left, saying that she would leave them. The main character carefully walked past the guests, looking around and trying to find her friend in the crowd. She understood that Yuno, although adopted, was still the daughter of the Ophelia family, so it was strange that she was not at the reception. While the heroine was walking in thought, she accidentally bumped into a girl, immediately apologizing for her inattention. But she only coughed, did not answer, and quickly walked away. Capella thought this was strange. After some time, Charla appeared before the guests, thanking everyone for visiting her on such a beautiful day, stating that she had prepared an exciting game for them. Smiling, the girl introduced the name of the game. The most desired gift for Charla. Ophelia said that in this mansion, there is what she wants most of all, and whoever finds it first will receive a prize. Namely, as a gift, one of the jewels from the birthday girl's box. All the girls around, hearing about this, beamed with joy and anticipation. But the heroine didn't give a damn. As soon as Charla announced the start of the game, everyone immediately rushed from their seats. Capella thought it was all some kind of stupidity and had no desire to participate, but it seemed to her an excellent opportunity to find her friend. Then Oberon called out to the girl, asking if she had heard about the beginning of the game. Raquel appeared nearby, smiling and saying that if the prize was jewelry, then he would simply buy any jewelry of the highest quality. The prince immediately froze, and then began to talk about how he was also very rich. Raquel, bowing to Capella, declared that he would give her gold necklaces, which would be decorated with gold stones. The main character understood that she would have liked it before, but after her death, she became completely uninterested in it. The girl admitted that she wanted more than jewelry, and then went ahead, saying that she wanted to be alone for a little while. The boys were very surprised by this, but did not follow. Entering the mansion, Capella began to look around. Her goal was to find her friend, but while she walked everywhere, she could not find her anywhere. It seemed to her that some strange atmosphere reigned here. After all, there were so many guests in the mansion, and there was no one at all in the corridors. Then Ruri broke away from the girl's shoulder and flew forward. In front of her, the heroine saw a door with a sign where it was written that this was Yuno's room. Coming closer to the door, Capella knocked carefully, calling out to her friend and warning her who had come to see her. But there was no answer. Therefore, the main character decided to go inside, which she reported and slowly opened the door, immediately apologizing. But what she saw in front of her shocked her. There was a girl sitting on the floor by the wall. Blood was flowing from her mouth right onto her dress. And those same memories from the past immediately flashed before Capella's eyes, when someone framed her by killing Oberon. The main character screamed loudly in fear. Her screams were heard by Raquel and the prince, who turned in fear towards the source of the sound. Capella covered her mouth with her hand, looking at the girl's body in shock. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. Then the boys arrived, seeing her in one of the rooms. They ran to her. Oberon immediately sat down next to her, asking if she was okay. Raquel immediately turned his attention to the girl by the wall. Capella rushed to the prince, looking at him with fear and declaring that she was not at all to blame. She was afraid that everything would happen again and death was approaching her again. But then Oberon hugged her tightly, saying that he knew perfectly well that his bride had nothing to do with it. This struck her. She could not understand whether he really believed her. Then Raquel leaned over her, and smiling, the boy said that he would call the adults, asking his friend not to worry about anything. And then he turned to the prince, asking him to look after her. He replied that he knew everything perfectly well without him. Oberon hugged the heroine tighter, calling her his precious bride. Now she could not even think about such a thing. After all, Capella didn't think that both of them would just go and believe her, given the past. But now she was sincerely glad. After some time, the injured girl was transferred to a room, and after examining her, it became clear that due to a chronic illness, she was constantly coughing up blood. Her parents also arrived to see her. Her mother stood by the bed, holding her daughter's hand. She did not understand why everything turned out this way, because she gave her the necessary medicines. Mr. Ophelia suddenly turned to the heroine, saying, he explained to the mother that she was the first to discover her daughter in such a state, and then he came closer to the girl, asking what had happened there. Leaning over her, he asked with a creepy grin if the girl would tell him everything that had happened before her eyes. The heroine was very frightened by this man, and he continued to ask if she had seen any medicine nearby. She was very scared, because they might not believe the prince, because he himself was still a child, so adults would hardly listen to him. She was scared to die again, as happened in the past. But then the door to the room swung open, and Corvus appeared, looking for his daughter. He looked extremely angry and dissatisfied. The girl immediately rushed to him, saying that she did nothing and saw nothing. Capella tried to explain to her father that she was just looking for Yuno, and when she found her room, she decided to go in there and check. And there was this girl lying there. The man, after listening to his daughter, said that this was enough, but she continued to say that she was not guilty. And then Corvus asked her not to say another word. These words hit her in the very soul. The girl froze, as if she was afraid to hear this more than anything in the world. She remembered that in fact he never believed her. But suddenly, he put his hand on her head, declaring that, of course, he believed her, asking her not to worry about anything. Hearing these words, tears flowed from Capella's eyes. She could not believe her ears. And Corvus turned to Lord Ophelia, asking him to explain. The man looked angry and asked why his dear daughter was in tears. It was useless to beg him for forgiveness. Capella looked at her father from the side and still could not come to her senses because she thought that no one would believe her at all. These were the words that the main character so wanted to hear because the father had just said that he believed his daughter. This time everything turned out differently. Even Prince Oberon and Raquel, and of course her father himself, they all believed her words. The girl was sure that this time she would not die just like that. Now the main character was incredibly happy, hugging the bird to herself. Her soul was so warm for the first time in a long time. Gathering her strength, Capella decided to clarify the situation, explaining that this girl had been coughing even before the game began, because she had met her by chance in the garden, and after that they had never seen each other again. This was all so that the heroine would know. After listening to her, Lord Ophelia laughed, assuming that the guest must have lost her medicine somewhere, adding that he would immediately order a search of the entire estate. But then Charla's voice was heard. She suddenly appeared in the room. She said with a sly smile that she had something to say. Her father, seeing her, was surprised, and the girl immediately approached Capella, asking whether she and the victim had quarreled in that garden recently. Looking at her rival, Charla accused the heroine of stealing the medicine. She understood that Lady Ophelia was clearly trying to get rid of her in every way, even accusing her of something she did not do. Grabbing the main character by the hem of her dress, Charla grinned, saying that she heard that her dress was dirty again, and that was why the girl had quarreled with the victim. The heroine could barely contain herself. And then she suddenly turned towards the bed where the girl was lying and offered to find out everything from her. Capella said that Yuno could cure her, even without having a medicine. Looking into Charlie's eyes, the girl said that then they would be able to ask directly who exactly was to blame for this situation. Grabbing Lady Ophelia by the shoulders, Capella began to scream, trying to find out where Yuno was now. But she only looked at her with a grin. Then the main character could not stand it, lowered her hands, and declared that she would bring her friend here herself. Turning around, the girl quickly walked away, while Charla carefully shook something off her shoulder, where her enemy's hand had just lain. And then she turned to her father, asking if she should go look for medicine. He looked down at her, saying that he would not forgive his daughter for her second mistake. At first she was scared, but then a smile quickly appeared on her face. Looking at him, the girl declared that Capella would never be able to find her adopted sister. She was sure of it. At this time, the main character was running around the entire mansion, trying to find her friend. The girl ran around all the corridors, already out of breath. But then the head of the family, Ophelia, stopped her, with a creepy smile, saying that she shouldn't overexert herself so much, and it would be better to leave this matter to the adults. But the girl threw his hand away. Looking at the man, Capella stated that she was one of those who always accepted a fight, after which she ran off again to search, which greatly infuriated the Lord. The main character understood that Yuno would hardly be inside the mansion, and assumed that she might be in some suspicious place, and then remembered one of them, the dungeon, immediately heading there, and was about to ask the knights who were guarding the passage about it, but then someone's hands covered her eyes. It was Raquel, who was smiling and looking at her from behind his back. Winking at his friend, the boy asked if she would like to have a cup of tea with him. Without waiting for an answer, he dragged her away with him. She resisted, saying that she had no time for tea at all. The boy replied that he understood. But then a girl's voice called out to Capella. A familiar girl was pouring tea in front of the main character. It was she who was saved by her and Raquel, along with her brother. She handed Capella a cup of tea, asking her to enjoy it before it got cold. Behind the maid stood her brother, who looked very intimidating, so the heroine felt some pressure. Taking a sip of the drink, the main character immediately exclaimed enthusiastically. This made the girl very happy. Raquel explained that her dream is to work in the royal palace. While she and her brother were rejoicing at their success, Capella asked her friend about their origins, and he explained that they were both ordinary commoners. Winking at the heroine, he asked if their status would change once they had a new queen. Hinting at Capella's marriage to the prince, he stated that they would need to build connections. Then, the maid came closer to them, looking at the heroine and boldly declaring that Yuno was most likely now in the underground dungeon. Hearing this, the cup of tea fell from the girl's hands. She couldn't believe it, because her friend was a saint and couldn't deserve such disgusting treatment. The chapel asked if Yuno was being kept underground, and the maid replied that the saint was being subjected to violence there every day, and that the passage there was already known to the main character. These words seemed to knock the ground out from under the young lady's feet. She stared at one point, listening to everything that was being told to her. Now it became clear to her that the room she saw was not Yuno's real room, and most likely, Charla simply remade the sign. Getting up from her seat, Capella was about to run to help her friend. But then Raquel spoke up. Standing next to his new servant, the boy asked if the main character would remember how this girl helped her, because Capella should become the future queen. Smiling, the heroine moved forward, answering that even if she wanted to, she would not be able to forget such a beauty, adding that she would thank her a little later. But the boy stopped her, grabbing her hand. He explained that the stairs to the basement were guarded by knights, and then hinted that it was time to use someone in such a situation. After some time, the three of them were standing at the entrance to the basement. Oberon arrived there, who ordered the knights to let them look at what was below. They became nervous, not knowing what to do. Then the young prince pulled out the royal emblem from his pocket. Showing it to them, he indignantly asked if they knew the meaning of this emblem, hinting that it was not worth opposing the royal family. Behind the boy's back, Capella whispered to Raquel, asking if they were doing the right thing at all. He replied that if the queen found out, she would be angry. But in this situation at least, the prince turned out to be very useful. While they were watching Oberon argue with the knights, the boy noticed that the prince loved the main character very much, which he told her this confused the girl a little, and he continued to say that her fiancé would not even ask questions when his beloved needed help. Capella felt strange, because that was what one would really think if she didn't know what would happen in the future, so there was nothing to be happy about. Here, Oberon called out to the heroine, smilingly declaring that they had finally been let down, and the knights immediately rushed to report everything to Charles. Without wasting any time, the three of them headed down. Capella going first, of course. They slowly descended through the dark and creepy basement, constantly looking back. The main character constantly covered her nose with a handkerchief, talking about the unpleasant smell inside these walls. She was surprised that her friend was really being kept in such conditions. Then, unexpectedly, Ruri flew off from Capella's shoulder, flying somewhere ahead. The girl rushed after her, and then in the distance, she saw a lonely cell and a person inside it. Coming closer, the heroine noticed Yuno lying on the floor. She looked very bad and was covered in bruises. She heard a familiar voice, opening her eyes. Capella immediately rushed to her, lifting her friend into her arms. She was scared and angry at the one who did something like that to the saint. She was able to smile even through force. Behind the boys, a man's voice and clapping of hands were heard. It was Lord Ophelia. He laughed, saying that he fully expected this from his adopted daughter's faithful friend, adding that her spirit of diligence was wonderful, but the man did not think that the girl would go so far. Approaching the heroine, he declared that she had apparently gotten too carried away with her game. Ophelia kept herself in check, saying that walking around someone else's house without permission is a trait of ill-mannered ladies. She in response began to shout at him, holding Yuno in her arms. She did not understand why they treated the saint like that. The man explained that this was called education, because for generations it was their family that was trusted with the education of saints, and although Yuno was a saint, she was originally an orphan, and she needs to become a saint who will be worshipped by the people. Ophelia explained that this girl will not catch up with the lost education overnight, and will never be able to catch up with them in terms of education, because dirty blood flows through her. After these words, the man grabbed Capella by the hand, asking her to provide a sacred education to those who already have experience, and adding that she can return to the top, squeezing her wrist tighter. Here Oberon joined in, pulling out his dagger and pointing it at the Lord, who glanced at him out of the corner of his eye. The boy did not like that his bride was being hurt. Ophelia, laughing, let go of Capella, asking the prince to put away the sword, because it was dangerous. He replied that the man had apparently completely forgotten himself. After all, according to Oberon, Yuno is his fiancé's friend, and therefore his friend too, still pointing his sword at the Lord. He was indignant at his methods of upbringing and promising not to leave it unattended. After this, the prince went to help the heroine, offering to cut the rope on the saint's hands. But the lord was furious and could not answer the prince. Capella sincerely thanked her fiancé for such help, while he cut the rope with his sword and replied that there was no need to thank him, because he did what he had to. But then the main character turned to him again, declaring that she had a request for him. After such an appeal, the young prince blushed, and the girl added that she and Yuno had a big request for him. Oberon immediately agreed to listen, and Capella immediately voiced what she needed, thinking that she was doing all this for the sake of her friend. And then she returned to her, trying to lift her up, because they needed to go upstairs. She resisted, explaining that she would stain the heroine's dress, but she suddenly declared that for her now there was nothing more important than the saint. Taking her friend by the hand, Yuno was very surprised that she really had such an opinion about her. After that, they slowly headed upstairs, and the prince asked the lord to go with him. After this, everyone dispersed except Raquel, who remained standing near the camera, as if waiting for something. Leaning against the bars, the boy, smiling, thought that it was strange to hear such adult words from the lips of a 10-year-old child. It seemed to him that he had taught Capella something unnecessary. At this time, the girl who had lost her medicine was literally dying in front of people's eyes. Even the queen was wondering if nothing could be done. The doctor standing nearby explained that he had already ordered the medicine and it would only be delivered tomorrow. But then a child's voice was heard behind the adults, which made everyone turn around. Corvus learned that his daughter had arrived. Capella entered the room, supporting her friend by the hand so that she would not fall, and the heroine turned to the queen, saying that she wanted to discuss something with her. Then Yuno looked up and saw the sick girl. The saint immediately rushed to her. The main character tried to stop her, because she was in a terrible state, but she replied that she was a saint and she did not care what happened to her. She did not care how many times her life would have to change. After all, Yuno was not going to give this role to someone else. A green light suddenly shone around the girl. She was going to help someone who was now suffering greatly. Approaching the girl, the saint placed her hand on her forehead, assuring her that everything would be fine. A green and bright light slowly illuminated the room, surprising everyone around. A few seconds later, the victim regained her healthy appearance and was breathing calmly. The girl's mother immediately rejoiced at this miracle and burst into tears. And Yuno, out of helplessness, collapsed right into the arms of her friend, who screamed that she was not only a saint, but also her friend. Raising her face towards herself, Capella noticed that the girl had suddenly fallen asleep, apparently having exhausted all her strength. Then Corvus appeared behind the main character, saying that his daughter had gotten herself into something again, although in fact he was very worried, because he saw the state her friend was in. Calling out to her father, she looked up at him and, smiling, declared that she was completely fine. He understood that the girl simply did not want to make him worry, but Capella stated that Oberon protected her. Corvus immediately raised his head in surprise. And the heroine continued speaking, also mentioning Raquel, who helped a lot. The prince was proud of himself, but Raquel was a little tense. The father immediately turned around, cursing everyone around. Apparently, he did not like this company for his daughter. At this point, the queen intervened, asking them to stop making eyes at each other. She then turned to Mr. Ophelia to let Lady Yuno rest a little. He bowed, thanking her for taking care of his daughter. The woman noted that she looked like she was dying. He blamed it all on her character and the troubles she was causing. Capella also intervened sharply, turning to the queen. Because she had something to say, the girl stated that her friend was subjected to terrible violence every day. Lord Ophelia suddenly tensed up, pretending not to understand what she was talking about, and the heroine asked to reconsider the role of the two great ducal families. The woman decided to clarify whether Capella wanted her to entrust the saint to their family. She was surprised, saying no, because she was too much trouble. This amazed the queen and everyone around, although the reason was different, because Capella could still be executed, and therefore she was worried that this could affect Yuno too. Holding her friend closer to her, the girl understood that if they continued to treat her this way, it would all end badly. At this point, Corvus wanted to intervene, but the queen stopped him with a single gesture of her hand, explaining that it was perfectly normal to say what you thought. After patting the main character on the head, the woman said that such childish courage was beautiful and asked Capella to continue working so hard, and when she could find something that needed to be changed, she could not hesitate to contact her, because the woman wanted to work together. After that, she ordered Yuno to be taken to the doctor, and then returned to the others. First of all, she ordered her son to return to the palace. At this point, Charla intervened in the conversation, asking if they really wanted to let the original culprit of what happened go just like that, pointing to Capella and stating that it was she who stole the medicine. She wanted to be heard before the main character managed to run away, supposedly with her tail between her legs, while Capella approached her. Looking at the girl with a smirk, she asked if she was really going to falsely accuse her of all this. Capella recalled that earlier, Charla had said that someone had stolen the girl's medicine, and then hinted that she knew perfectly well that that room did not belong to Yuno, since that sign was clearly not her style. The heroine also remembered that her friend had a maid who used to work in this mansion. After this mention, she immediately asked Raquel for permission. He, smiling, replied that she could do it if she wanted. But the prince was furious at the way the boy was talking to his bride. He said that he would bring the maid whom he had recently exchanged for the necklace. As soon as Charla heard this, she immediately tensed up, and her father began to lose his temper. The man turned to the girls, asking why they had quarreled so much and whether they were tired of it. Because everything could be fixed, it was clear that his patience was running out. But then Ruri tore herself off her mistress's shoulder and pounced on Charla, circling around her. She tried to drive her away and screamed, and then something fell out of her dress, jingling. It was a medicine bottle that immediately attracted everyone's attention, and the girl froze, looking at the jar in fear and already wanted to rush after it. But then Corvus intercepted him, lifting the bottle. He noticed that there was powder left at the bottom. He was interested in what kind of medicine was inside. And as soon as he said that it was worth asking the doctor about this, Charla simply sank, realizing that her lie was over, and her father was slowly approaching her. Lord Ophelia swung and hit his daughter right in the child's face with his fist. She immediately fell to the floor. Everyone around froze. The main character gasped in fear. Corvus put his arm around his daughter's shoulder, silently observing the situation, while Charla looked up at her father in fear, her face, which was already bruised. But then he took his daughter by the head and hit her face on the floor with all his might, shouting that he was sorry because she had just committed a terrible stupidity, and he would immediately send her to a monastery and force her to renounce their family name. She, crying, said that she wanted to enter the Academy of Hercules. Moving away from the girl, he looked at his daughter for the last time, ordering her not to disappoint him anymore, because now he was disgusted even to think that Charla was his daughter. The girl, with tears in her eyes, extended her hand to Raquel, declaring that she had always loved him, her body trembling with fear and pain. He, looking at Charla with contempt, asked why he should suddenly love the one who wanted to harm his little sister. And the words that he hated people like her the most finished the girl off completely. She asked herself why everything had happened this way, and then rushed to Capella, grabbing her by the hem of her dress. Charla kept shouting that she didn't understand why the heroine got everything she wanted, but she remained a loser. It seemed to her that having the status of a high-ranking family was all that was needed for happiness. Crying on her knees before Capella, the girl envied her, because her father loved her, and she could marry the one she loved. Charla literally went crazy, not understanding what the difference was between them, while her tears flowed down the heroine's dress. She, looking at the girl sitting on her knees in front of her, coldly and briefly answered that she was just lucky, and that was all. This answer amazed the blonde. When the knights dragged Charla into the carriage, she resisted and ordered them to let her go. She was shaking with fear and felt betrayed by her own parents. Capella watched all this from the window, realizing that Ophelia's father had turned away from her just as he would turn away from her someday, as had happened in the past. Knowing that Corvus was standing behind her, the girl asked him if he would ever leave her if she suddenly stood in his way. He was surprised by such a sharp question. In the heroine's head, there were thoughts that her father had also abandoned her that day, just as Charla had just been abandoned, and she simply wanted the love that was lacking. It was not clear to her, indeed, how they differed from each other, because if Capella had not returned to the past, then Lady Ophelia's life could have remained happy. But now it is clear to the heroine that she is building her happiness on someone else's misfortune, although one day she too will be betrayed. The girl's thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a weak blow to the head with a fan. Turning around, she saw the queen in front of her, who asked her not to offend her dear daddy. The heroine was surprised by such an address. The woman explained that she did not know another reckless parent like Corvus. That's why she wanted the main character to remember one thing: even if the whole world turns away from her, her father will be on her side. Stroking Capella on the head and smiling at her, the queen stated that she wanted to be like him, but because of her position, she could not take anyone's side. And then, pointing at Corvus, she said that he would do anything, even throw away his social status, just to be on his daughter's side. Looking at Capella, the queen admitted that she said this as the greatest woman in the country, so the girl could believe her words. And then the main character remembered that day, the day of the execution, because she was there then too. The queen then looked as if she was in great, great pain, and the girl wondered why she hadn't remembered this before. With tears in her eyes, Capella apologized for her words, realizing that there was only anger in her heart that day, and that was why she felt like the queen hated her. The girl apologized to the woman again, and then decided to confess what she had always thought about. Looking at the queen, the main character admitted that she always considered her just a grumpy old woman. These words shocked the woman and Corvus. None of them expected such a sharp confession. Here Yuno appeared at the door, asking for forgiveness for such a sudden arrival. Capella, not noticing how angry Her Highness was, immediately rushed to her friend. Rejoicing at her arrival, she began to ask her about her health. The saint thanked her, and then with a smile asked the heroine not to forget that the saint must be protected, otherwise it would affect the family. The queen came closer to Corvus, discussing the girls. Yuno seemed like a persistent lady to her. The man only chuckled with a smile in response. Capella, discussing something with her friend, laughed loudly. Oberon stood next to them, also joining in their conversation. They looked very happy. Here Raquel, looking out the window, announced that his carriage had arrived, and the main character replied that he could go first. But then he, smiling, came up close to Capella, took her by the chin, and looked straight into her eyes. She became embarrassed. She felt awkward because of the way the boy stroked her cheek and did not take his eyes off her. And then Raquel did something completely unexpected. He kissed the main character on the cheek. She immediately blushed, not understanding what to respond to such a gesture. And the prince, looking at this, could not believe his eyes, and simply stood with his mouth open while his bride was kissed before his eyes. Afterwards, Raquel waved to Capella, saying that he hoped that they would be friends after they entered the academy, despite the age difference. The girl stood silently, continuing to hold her hand on her cheek, and simply watched her friend as he walked away. Oberon suddenly came to his senses and exclaimed, asking what the relationship was between Capella and Raquel. Corvus, in the background, was simply furious. She replied that he could very well become her older brother. The father intervened, saying that the matter had not yet been decided, and he himself wanted to kill the boy. But the prince exclaimed, saying that brothers and sisters usually do not kiss. But then the queen grabbed him by the ear and dragged him home, explaining that his twisted mind could go even further if he was not taken away. So they quickly said goodbye and left. Capella, waving her hand back at them, could not understand whether these two had been so noisy before. Then Yuno's voice was heard. Smiling and noticing that everyone was very lively today, she came to thank her friend for her help. Taking Capella by the hands, the saint sincerely thanked her for what she had done for her today. She, smiling, explained that she was ready to do anything for her. Lowering her eyes, Yuno suddenly asked if she liked her. She, without hesitation, gave a positive answer, and the girl thanked her for such honesty and sincerity. After some time, Corvus and Capella were sitting in the carriage, heading home. The man suddenly spoke, saying that he had something to say to his daughter. She immediately thought that it was because she often used the prince for her own purposes, but her father suddenly declared that he would help her no matter what, which greatly surprised the girl. Corvus continued to talk about how, even if he broke his arms and legs, lost his voice and his eyesight, he would do whatever was necessary. Moving forward towards his daughter, He also added that he would even risk his life for her, because he was not interested in anything in this world except Capella, so he asked her not to forget about this. The girl lowered her head, and then asked if her father would change his mind, even if she suddenly did something bad, if she did something that would make the whole world hate her. He, looking at her, replied that he would not change his mind. He himself thought that, for him, this would be a gift of fate, which would mean that he was the only one who loved his daughter with all his heart. And then Corvus suddenly thought that this was the perfect plan, to go against the whole world together with Capella. The girl, hearing her father's thoughts, tensed up. She didn't understand what to do, because it was hard to believe that this man had left her that day without any reason, thinking that circumstances had played a role, but she didn't know if she could believe it 100%. Capella, looking up at her father, suddenly reminded him that she had not sat on his lap for a long time. He was surprised by this, saying that she was already big, although in fact he himself really wanted this. Having placed his daughter on his lap, the man stroked her head with a smile, saying that she was too much trouble, and she smiled back at him. The next day, Yuno, already in her own room, was talking with the same stepfather. He asked if she needed to go to church, and asked her not to overexert herself in her studies. She, smiling, thanked him, calling him stepfather, and when he turned away, she suddenly turned to him, calling him father. He turned around abruptly, looked at his daughter with horror, but then the saint suddenly changed her mind, saying that she didn't need anything. After that, he left the room, and Yuno sat down at the table, holding a book in her hands and looking out the window, realizing that she had suddenly forgotten herself. Looking at the sky, the girl realized that, thanks to the chapel, she was able to quickly find a comfortable life. But then, on the windowsill in front of her, she saw that very bird, Ruri. It was sitting in front of the girl, and she did not drive it away and continued to study, although she knew all the questions from beginning to end. Yuno sighed and smiled as she thought about how she had a very problematic best friend. Oberon, holding the sheet with the final grade for the exam, was shocked. Because his score was much lower than Capella's, he understood that he had room to grow. The boy, feeling dejected, suggested that at this rate he would not be able to enter the same school as his fiancée. Corvus stated that the fact that Oberon was a prince would be enough, but the girl considered this unfair. Her father thought that there was no point in her going to this school, because if she wanted to become a queen, then an ordinary school for girls would be enough. He wanted her to always be near him. Here Oberon objected, declaring that he did not dare to act so unfairly and take advantage of his status. And then the prince turned to Corvus, asking him to study with him and help him improve his knowledge. And Capella and her father were very surprised by this request. But the prince did not receive a refusal, and the man immediately began to study with the young prince, with all the severity with which he could do it. After only 2 hours, Oberon looked barely alive from the amount of knowledge he had received. Looking at Capella, he could not understand how it was not difficult for her to study. She replied that she was already used to it. Turning the pen in her hand, the girl smiled, thinking that she had started studying properly 2 years ago, and besides, this was her second life. Plus, she had a tutor. Smiling as she recalled, Capella realized that she used to be like His Highness when she heard her father's voice, turning to the prince and asking if he was used to sitting still. Looking at the boy, the man suggested that people like him might benefit from learning on the move. And the main character added that she had spurs, just in case, after which they headed to the garden. After a while, Oberon wielded his sword and simultaneously recounted what he had managed to remember. This method really helped the boy. Corvus and Capella, watching the prince, were surprised. The girl did not think that he would really take on this in such a way. The father mentally agreed with his daughter. Looking at the boy, the girl realized that the prince, with a sword in his hands, looked pretty cool, smiling. She called him a liar out loud. Now her head was filled only with Oberon. She really thought he was cool, kind, and when he smiled, Capella thought he was very cute. But, on the other hand, the heroine understood that one day he would leave her. When the prince moved on to the story of the royal poetry, mentioning that she wrote good poems about love, he suddenly froze, as if trying to digest this word. Love. The sword suddenly fell from the boy's hands to the ground, and he suddenly asked if everything was okay. Realizing that the main character was looking at him, Oberon immediately reached for his sword. But apparently, he then changed his mind, turning to his fiancée and asking if perhaps he should break off the engagement after all. Hearing this, Capella fell into a stupor, and he looked at her as if expecting some kind of answer. The prince decided to ask the same question again. Should he break off this engagement? The girl still could not believe that he was actually saying this. Capella couldn't understand why he suddenly started talking about this, or if this was their fate, which would overtake their couple sooner or later. The girl's hands were shaking, and Corvus noticed this. The man turned to the prince, asking him what he meant, while his daughter stared into space in confusion. She understood, looking at him, that last time everything was completely different, that the prince was currently alive and well. Smiling, she asked the boy to stand still and not move. A few seconds later, standing on the edge of the balcony, she stepped forward and flew down. Corvus immediately became afraid for his child, as did Oberon. But nothing bad happened, because the prince was able to catch his bride, after which they fell to the ground together. The father, watching his daughter's crazy act, was, to put it mildly, in shock, and Oberon, looking at Capella, asked what she was doing all of a sudden. She grabbed the prince by the collar, looked at him with tears in her eyes, and asked if she had done something wrong, or if he didn't like something about her, because for some reason he wanted to leave her. Capella wanted to know the reason for such a decision, because, in her opinion, he could not just disappear without explaining himself. While she was saying all this, bitter tears were running down her cheeks. Oberon, grabbing his bride by the shoulders, shouted that the main character had done nothing wrong. She, watching him, continued to cry. The prince, blushing, suddenly admitted that the whole reason was hidden in Raquel. He sharply asked if Capella liked this boy. She, hearing this, was surprised. Oberon looked down, remembering the moment when Raquel kissed her, and she made a cute face, so he thought that she liked him. In response to this, the main character laughed, answering that no, because she did not consider him in such a way. Wiping away her tears, Capella explained that if anyone were kissed so suddenly, they would blush just as much. Then the prince suddenly grabbed the heroine by the hand, reached for her face, and then for her lips, but miscalculated a little, so their noses collided with each other. After apologizing to his bride, Oberon promised that he would train better. Capella did not understand what he was talking about, and then he put his hand on the girl's cheek. Smiling, the prince winked at her, after which he complimented the heroine, calling her very sweet, after which her cheeks flared up as if from fire. Not knowing what to answer, Capella suddenly asked if he would say anything else. He decided to ask who she liked then, since she was not interested in Raquel. This question confused the heroine even more. Looking down, the heroine realized that there was only one image in her head now: Prince Oberon, who still wouldn't leave her little head. The girl was embarrassed and worried before giving a final answer.